Section 14 of With the Royal Army Medical Corps in Egypt by Sergeant Major R.A.M.C. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13 Army Dental Surgery in Egypt. One of the most difficult questions with which the R.A.M.C. in Egypt has had to deal has been that of the dental treatment of the troops, the preservation of existing teeth by various devices, as well as the provision of artificial teeth where the natural means of mastication have been found unserviceable. This matter lies at the very heart of the problem of the maintenance of fighting efficiency in an army. If a good and abundant supply of the right sort of food is a soldier's first requisite on active service, his next most important need is the wherewithal to make use of it. Under the old, strict conditions of enlistment in pre-war times, only those men possessing a high proportion of good sound teeth were accepted for the army, and thereafter their fitness in this respect was regularly and thoroughly supervised by the medical authorities. But on the outbreak of the present conflict, when thousands of recruits were needed instead of hundreds as heretofore, these conditions were necessarily and very properly relaxed. Provided a man was sound in all other respects, we could not afford to look him too closely in the mouth. The fact of his general health being good was taken to indicate that what teeth he possessed sufficed for all practical purposes, and would probably continue to do so for such time as the war might reasonably be expected to last. Very few in those days, as will be well remembered, entertained any suspicion that the war would run into years. It was time, however, which proved the disturbing element in our calculations on this head, as indeed on all others. Under the wear and tear of prolonged active service, and the effects of hardtack rations, the teeth of a great many men eventually gave out. The medical authorities found themselves faced with the problem of how to restore dental health and masticating power among the men, and so to retain them fit and well for the firing line. The problem became an acute one very early in the Egyptian campaign. The trying climate and highly septic dust and sand which were continually blowing into the mouths of the men and gaining access to their food, as well as the scarcity of water on the desert, which rendered proper cleansing of mouth and teeth intermittent and often impossible, all combined to aggravate the matter. It was not only that the absence of serviceable teeth prevented the due preparation of the food in the mouth, thus interfering with nutrition and resulting in general loss of vitality, but the decaying teeth introduced an active poison into the system, tending to a condition of unfitness for duty, and not seldom to the production of positive disease. Large numbers of men were continually being sent down from the firing line to the base, whose sickness was due in the first instance to the condition of their teeth, and at one time the problem, from a military point of view, threatened to assume serious proportions. As with all other difficulties which have faced the medical authorities of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, this problem was met and overcome by the same tried methods of combined energy, ingenuity, and organising care. The system of sending to the base all men in need of dental treatment, necessary as it was in serious cases, was neither requisite nor desirable with those whose trouble was comparatively slight or only temporary in nature. Very early, therefore, in the advance of the force over the Sinai Desert, a new system was instituted. The main principle of this was to attach dental surgeons to certain of the field ambulances operating close to the front, so that dental aid would be available within a reasonable distance of all fighting units. The main function of these field dentists was to sift out all cases into their various degrees of gravity. Minor cases, requiring only treatment for the relief of pain, or where the decay, limited to a few teeth, was so advanced as to render extraction unavoidable, would be dealt with summarily on the spot, and the men returned at once to their units to carry on with what sound teeth remained to them. Cases where the teeth causing the trouble were still of a useful character, and therefore worth stopping, cases where the need for artificial teeth existed, and cases in which some septic complication was present, were sent to the nearest casualty clearing station, where the dental surgeon in charge was furnished with proper equipment and mechanical appliances for the task. At the casualty clearing stations, again, a second sifting took place, only those men needing comparatively brief treatment being there retained. The remainder, those requiring more or less complete dentures, and those needing drastic medical as well as dental attention, were sent down to the base to be dealt with by the permanent dental establishments at Cairo or Alexandria. This filtering system had at once the happy result of materially relieving the congestion of patients which had hitherto existed at the base, and allowing the surgeons there to devote more time to those patients urgently requiring it. Also, no doubt, it put a stop to a certain amount of malingering, the prospect of a return to civilisation, for what nearly always proved a protracted period while awaiting their turn for treatment at the overworked base depots, being an irresistible allurement to many war-worn men, who, in addition, were demoralised by incessant agonising toothache. At the same time, the dental staffs available at Cairo and Alexandria were reorganised. Probably there is no medical officer in the R.A.M.C. who, if asked to name the hardest worked branch in the Corps, would not unhesitatingly award the palm to his own particular denomination. It is certain, however, that the body of dental surgeons doing duty in Egypt have been second to none in energy and industry, as well as opportunity for exercising these qualities. The entire work of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, including the Sinai Desert Column, the Canal Zone Troops, the Western Force, and the various British garrisons in Egypt, has been carried through by a staff of about 30 dental surgeons, a fact which speaks volumes for the organising ability of the senior officer in whose charge the whole dispositions were placed. Taking a typical specific period, we find that in this time a total number of 28,300 dental cases were treated, involving some 58,600 attendances at the depots. These included the cleaning and filling of about 17,000 partially decayed teeth, of which number about half required preliminary treatment in the form of nerve devitalisation and removal of septic root conditions, thus vastly increasing the work ordinarily called for in the process of filling. New dentures supplied during this period reached a total of only 4,000. This very moderate figure was undoubtedly due to the large amount of filling work done, and it represents a considerable economy to the public funds as well as advantage to the patients. In addition to the volume of dental work above indicated, over 28,000 summary extractions of hopelessly decayed teeth were performed within the same typical period, the men in nearly all cases being returned to their units forthwith. While at Cairo, the old system of attaching the dental surgeons with their mechanical staffs to the various base hospitals or convalescent depots was conveniently retained, at Alexandria a different procedure was adopted, owing to the number, varying character and wider distribution of the units involved. At this latter base, the dental establishments were removed altogether from the hospitals, and their forces concentrated under one roof at the convenient centre of Mustapha. This central depot was named the Dental Annex, and it gave continuous employment to about a dozen dental surgeons and some 50 assistants, of whom 23 were fully trained dental mechanics. All the tooth troubles of the Alexandria district were brought to the Annex, and both work and workers being thus congregated on one spot, a vast economy in time and labour was effected. Another equally commendable arrangement was that by which all cases of fractured jaw, due to shot and shell, were concentrated at one hospital in Alexandria, where they came under the immediate care of the senior dental surgeon stationed at the Annex. Men injured in this way require the most skilful treatment, and generally need splint appliances of a very ingenious and delicate character, specially designed for each case. Extensive bone grafting may have to be resorted to, and the contour of the face ultimately restored by what is known as plastic work, the introduction beneath the skin of sterilised paraffin wax to take the place of tissue lost. All this work comes within the scope of modern dental surgery. It is not pretended that a great deal of such work was undertaken by the R.A.M.C. dental surgeons with the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, but those cases which fell to their lot received the best that scientific care and skill could afford them. As a general wartime policy, nothing but straightforward, simple dental work was attempted throughout, with the single object of keeping as many men as possible fit for military service. The fact that to all intents and purposes we were a self-contained force was kept steadily in view, and all dental arrangements therefore made as complete as possible. But no man was treated from the personal, humanitarian standpoint alone. Our dental surgeons were out, like the rest of us, not primarily to alleviate human suffering, but to bring the war to a speedy end by maintaining the strength of the firing line by any and every means known to human ingenuity. Looking through the official records of this branch of the R.A.M.C. service, one is struck by the uniform smoothness and absence of delay with which the supply of dental material and appliances was kept up by the medical base depot, as well as by the variformity of the demands made upon it. Though the necessity for the provision of either partial or complete dentures was kept at a very low rate, by reason of the enormous amount of filling work which was carried through, an average periodical supply of 8,000 or 9,000 artificial teeth was needed for the men of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. but these formed only a small part of the material required. Besides multitudinous instruments, dental chairs, gas apparatus and the like, the actual manufacture of the dentures, these averaging perhaps 1,000 per month, called for a long list of articles. Moreover, a great proportion of this work was carried out by the casualty clearing stations far in advance of the base, and transport of the material and appliances, therefore, became an added and serious difficulty. Indeed, what has been accomplished in Egypt in dental surgery under active service conditions, and often actually under fire, might well astonish the reader if anything like a complete account of it could here be attempted. Before leaving this department of R.A.M.C. activity, mention must be made of the high technical standard reached by the Army dental mechanics in all their work for the men. There are secrets in every trade, and in none more so, perhaps, than in the mechanical side of dentistry. Nothing would be gained by revealing here the actual composition of the enamelled porcelain of which the artificial teeth were made, the nature of the filling amalgam, or the wonderful material of which the denture plates themselves are constructed. It must suffice to say that, as manufactured by the R.A.M.C. Dental Department, all these are as good and enduring as any supplied by civilian art. In regard to these materials, the word wonderful is used, and used advisedly. The making of a denture that shall retain its usefulness against all the severe tests and vicissitudes to which a soldier on active service is likely to submit it, is a far more complicated matter than may be generally supposed. Not only must the appliance be fitted and balanced with scientific precision, and be composed of material capable of resisting the hardest wear and tear, and even accidental violence, but it must have the quality of absolute immunity to the forces of expansion and contraction, both during manufacture and afterwards when in use. In the attainment of this property lies the vital trade secret, which must not here be touched upon. Suffice it that our army dentists possess that secret equally with the foremost in their craft, and are using it to good purpose in their own particular contribution towards winning the war. End of section 14. Section 15 of With the Royal Army Medical Corps in Egypt by Sergeant Major R.A.M.C. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Work of the Mustapha Reception Station, Alexandria. The story of the growth of the R.A.M.C. reception station at Mustapha near Alexandria almost deserves to rank as one of the romances of the Near East Medical Service, if unremitting hard work and difficulties valorously overcome may entitle a record of sheer dominant usefulness to that name. At the beginning of the war, the reception station was only a small affair designed to minister to the immediate medical needs of the British garrison on the spot. It attended to minor ailments and injuries so little serious, or of such a temporary character, as to be outside the scope of a full-dress military hospital. Its activities were such as could be met by the services of one R.A.M.C. non-commissioned officer and an orderly, and a provision of 4 beds sufficed for such cases as needed a few days' detention and course of treatment. At the present time of writing, the Mustapha reception station has grown into an establishment of prime importance, with a considerable medical and nursing staff, and a bed accommodation for over 200 patients. During the period extending from August 1915 to January 1917, many thousands of men have, for one reason or another, passed through its hands. Locality was the determining cause of its rise into military fame. Mustapha is a suburb of the great Egyptian seaport of Alexandria, where many of our troops disembarked. It is nothing more than a fine open stretch of seaside desert eminently suited for a large military camp, not only on account of its natural advantages, but because of its contiguity to the place of disembarkation, to the railway, and to a good municipal water supply. Mustapha, with the district bordering on it, was therefore seized upon by the Army authorities for a main concentration camp, where the bulk of the human material required by our operations in the Near East was stored pending dispatch elsewhere. A cloud of white canvas and semi-permanent buildings soon spread over the breezy, sun-stepped waste of Mustapha and its environs, and the little reception station suddenly found itself a master wheel in the great military machine. The real work of the station began with the inauguration of the Gallipoli campaign, and the opening out of the Egyptian, Mesopotamian and Salonican expeditions still further increased it. Practically all the troops coming to and going from the great camp at Mustapha passed through the reception station for some cause or other. In such a large depot it was inevitable that many cases of slight sickness should arise. These were treated and, where necessary, detained temporarily at the station. Whenever a new draft of men came in, all had to be medically inspected by the station medical officers, and given a clean bill of health before being sent among the bulk of their comrades in the camp. In the same way, bodies of troops leaving the depot for the front were examined at the station and certified as to fitness for active service. As the strength of the various regiments with the fighting columns became depleted, drafts were sent out from England to make up their deficiencies. Troops arrived from the European fronts for transference to the Eastern, or departures of troops took place for service in France. A continual journeying to and fro between the base camp at Mustapha and the various arenas of war, far and near, went on, and all units involved necessarily passed through the hard-worked reception station. In addition to the labour and vigilance needed to ensure the thorough medical inspection of such vast numbers of men, a systematic inoculation of every soldier leaving the base depot was instituted as a preventive measure against the contraction of diseases such as smallpox, typhoid, paratyphoid and cholera. In the period above named, no fewer than 35,600 inoculations were carried through by the medical officers of the reception station. As many as 1,433 men were treated in a single day, and in one period of 4 days 6,000 men passed through the station for this purpose. As is well known, inoculation is wholly voluntary in the Army. The men submit themselves to the process entirely of their own free will. These figures, therefore, speak volumes for the discerning power and judgment of our soldiers, at least as far as the Eastern armies are concerned. Incidentally, they bear equally valuable testimony to the common sense way in which the pros and cons of the inoculation question have been put before the men by our medical authorities in Egypt. It must be remembered that the figures above quoted in no way represent the whole number of men serving under the British flag in the East, who have thus allowed themselves to be scientifically protected against disease. They comprise only those who, for one reason or another, were embarked uninoculated, those who at first refused treatment, but have since been convinced of the error of their ways, and those who have been inoculated once, but who now require a second application owing to lapse of time rendering the first no longer efficacious. Another branch of work carried on by the reception station at Mustapha, less romantic but scarcely less important, has been that of the destruction of insect pests among the troops. Not all the horrors of war are confined to the battlefield. Many a combatant will be inclined to agree with the writer that the discomfort, nay, absolute torture, of certain otherwise stilly nights of peace endured in a verminous dugout or ship's bunk will rank among the most terrifying of his war experiences. If the R.A.M.C. had no other claim on the gratitude of the fighting units for services rendered, it would deserve it alone for what has been done in this matter of ridding the men of at least one trouble of the personal kind in the midst of so many unavoidable public cares. A very large proportion of the troops passing through the reception station were found to be infested by different kinds of body parasites, especially those recently returned from the fronts or just disembarked from the troopships. On their arrival at Mustapha, the men of each detachment were examined by our medical officers, and, if found to be infected, were detained and given an antiseptic bath on the spot, all their clothing and effects being in the meantime thoroughly fumigated. By these means a new start in complete personal cleanliness was assured for each man, the gross amount of comfort thus created being best realised when it is considered that, on a rough computation, about 20% of all the drafts that passed through the station were found to be harbouring some sort of vermin or other. It is not a pleasant subject upon which to dilate, but it is necessary to set down the fact in any account of R.A.M.C. doings which aspires to be a fairly complete one. There are other things to do in wartime under the Red Cross, besides organising camp concerts and doling out cigarettes and chocolate to wounded soldiers. The treatment of skin diseases formed also an important branch of the work of this reception station. A special skin department was opened there, and eventually men from all the eastern theatres of war, and even from the general hospitals in Egypt, were sent to Mustapha to be treated for these distressing and demoralising complaints. 200 of the beds in the station were permanently set apart for skin work, and at times of emergency as many as 350 skin patients have been under treatment simultaneously. In addition to the various kinds of work already enumerated, the routine duties of the station were numerous and heavy. A health inspection of every man in the camp was held weekly, and many cases of incipient disease were thus detected. The inspection was particularly useful in the matter of venereal diseases, wherein early recognition is so vital a factor as regards effective treatment. These were not merely cases of concealment, which very rightly constitutes a punishable offence in the Army. Frequently the men found to be affected were genuinely ignorant of their condition. The volume of work dealt with at the daily sick parade at Mustapha can be easily imagined when the vastness of the adjoining camps is considered. The output of the dispensary in medicines and small curative items was enormous. Some idea of its extent may be gathered from the fact that there were 28 separate stock mixtures designed for the amelioration of as many minor disorders constantly on tap. There also existed in the vicinity, at one time, a large detail camp, to which men sufficiently far advanced in recovery from wounds and illnesses were drafted from the large general hospitals. This arrangement materially relieved the congestion in the hospitals, but it proved a severe tax on the staff of the Mustapha reception station, upon whom devolved the task of completing the cure of these patients. The station also ran an isolation compound, where all men who had come into contact with cases of infectious disease could be detained for the officially prescribed quarantine period. As a final word in the enumeration of the many activities of this hard-worked branch of the R.A.M.C. in Egypt, it must be mentioned that on 4 days in each week a standing medical board sits at the station for the purpose of classifying into various categories of effectiveness the men drafted out of the camp. A peculiar and very trying feature of the work of this station throughout has been that, while the daily routine work went heavily and continuously on, the rest came in rushes. When drafts arrived, as many as 1,500 men have had to be medically examined at a stretch. End of section 15. Section 16 of With the Royal Army Medical Corps in Egypt by Sergeant Major R.A.M.C. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Medical Advisory Committee for the Near East. In the medical history of the war, when it comes to be written, 2 facts will stand prominently forth. The amazingly high standard of technical efficiency displayed by all branches of the Army Medical Service, and the extent to which expert knowledge in the innumerable departments of medical science has been called upon to aid the regular R.A.M.C. executive with the forces. This latter may be said to be a new departure in the art of waging war, taking its inception from the present campaign. And the notable success of its adoption cannot fail to revolutionise all ideas for the future, if war, except in its minor local sense, be destined to have any future, a thing which, it is safe to predict, the whole disgusted, blood-satiated world of thinking men and women will unite to prevent. Nowhere in the whole area of the war has this innovation been more fully exploited than in the Eastern Mediterranean, nor, indeed, could greater necessity for it have existed elsewhere. In the foregoing pages it has been fairly thoroughly demonstrated amidst what circumstances of unexampled difficulty our Army physicians and surgeons have carried on their work. Not only had all the injuries of war, ordinary and extraordinary, to be faced, not only had the common ailments incidental to any army of Europeans on active service to be dealt with, But there were all the dangers to health inseparable from the existence of white men in tropical countries, or under specially trying South European climatic conditions, to be faced with resources obtainable only from a base thousands of miles away. It is a matter of common history, however, that our medical service in the Near East held together magnificently against all these odds. This was due, of course, primarily to the efficiency, energy, and devotion unfailingly displayed by all ranks in the Royal Army Medical Corps. But our officers and men, from the highest to the lowest, received incalculable aid from the experts permanently attached to every denomination of the service. It is not too much to say that every soldier in our armies fighting in the Eastern Mediterranean area had at his disposal, in the event of his critical illness or injury, just as much expert medical or surgical help as he could have secured had he been a wealthy inhabitant of Park Lane. Many of the most famous names in medicine and surgery are to be found in the R.A.M.C. nominal roll of specialists doing duty in this war area, and their services were equally at the disposal of the Commander-in-Chief or the humblest private in the ranks. But the medical authorities at home were not content even with this eminently satisfying and heartening state of things. They realised that the entire R.A.M.C. organisation out here was working at full pressure, nay, at forced draught, and it could not be expected to have eyes at the back of its head. Such eyes, however, the Director General now determined to provide for us, and the resolve took effect in a singularly happy expedient. A committee of 5 experts, each one pre-eminent in his own particular subject, was chosen, and was sent out to the Eastern Mediterranean in July 1915. Its allotted duty was to pervade the whole scene of operations, and generally to advise the local executive authorities on any and every matter appertaining to the maintenance of health among the troops, but particularly to concern itself with the enormously important question of the prevention of epidemic diseases. Throughout all the Near Eastern operations, this latter problem has ever been the gravest with which our service has been called upon to deal. The military difficulties at the Dardanelles, at Salonika, in Mesopotamia, and on the Sinai Desert were all unexampled in their peculiar way, but it is doubtful whether they at any time surpassed in gravity that constantly presented by the problems confronting the medical service. As a single example of the kind of emergency we had to face, it may be mentioned that, during a period of only 6 weeks at the end of the summer of 1915, a large number of cases of diarrhoea and dysentery occurred among the troops dependent on the Egyptian medical base. Theoretically, of course, all these cases were cases of preventable disease. Practically a great many, possibly the vast majority, would have been prevented if only the hard-worked medical and sanitary executive throughout the military system had had time to look about it and to devise schemes for the future, both immediate and remote. This duty of looking about and contriving, admittedly of such pressing need and importance, was immediately assumed by the Medical Advisory Committee on its arrival in the Near East, and the fruit of the committee's activities soon became abundantly visible. The committee prosecuted its labours throughout a period of nearly 2 years, and some idea of the conscientious manner in which it performed the task allotted to it may be gathered from a mere itinerary of its travels. Arriving in July 1915, when the Dardanelles struggle was at its height, it spent the first 4 weeks in inspections in Egypt, in Alexandria, Cairo, and throughout the Suez Canal area. It then proceeded to Mudros, the advanced base for the Gallipoli force, where a large amount of useful inspection work was carried out. In September it crossed to the Peninsula and made a thorough round of our positions at Suvla, Anzac and Cape Helles. Thence it journeyed back to Mudros for more inspection work, returning to Egypt in October. Again in November it took ship for Mudros, crossed once more to the Peninsula for another series of inspections, was back in Mudros at the end of the month, when it almost immediately set sail for Salonika and the Serbo-Bulgarian frontiers, and there carried out an extended tour. This latter task occupied the greater part of December, and on its completion the committee made for Egypt once more. In 1916 the committee's movements were equally far-reaching and various. From January to April it remained in Egypt, carrying out a number of inspections in the contiguous war areas, especially the Canal Zone. At the end of April it again paid a visit to Salonika, passing thence to Malta and finding itself back in Egypt by the month of June. It now busied itself in the establishment of a head office, called the Epidemiological Bureau in Cairo, the object of which was to provide a centre whither periodical reports, clinical and statistical, could be sent from all medical units in the country, and where these could be tabulated and generally digested into practically usable form for the purpose of the committee's preventive work. Thereafter, the arena for this ubiquitous body's activities became twofold. 4 of its members, acting under special instructions now received from the War Office, proceeded to Mesopotamia early in August, returning to Egypt only in April 1917, after a most arduous winter campaign of inspections. The remaining member of the committee retained his headquarters in Cairo, where, together with his 2 epidemiological officers, he not only attended to the heavy duties of the Bureau, but contrived to find time for inspection visits to the Alexandrian camps and also for voyages to Malta, Salonika and the Bulgarian frontier once more. In May, by common consent of the authorities, both at home and abroad, the work of the committee was adjudged at an end, and its members then returned to England for a much deserved rest. Even thus set down in the dry matter of fact of a chronological sequence, the quality and extent of the labours of these 5 highly trained scientific men are sufficiently obvious. To have covered so many thousand miles of land and sea as their travels necessitated is in itself a notable achievement. But when one comes to examine the recorded results, the innumerable official reports on inspections and investigations, displaying so much patient assembling of facts widely scattered and difficult to come by, and so many ingenious deductions and recommendations, the wonder engendered in the mind of the plain everyday man of action is still more increased. The main facts that strike an unexpert but attentive reader of these reports is their scientific exactitude in dealing with detail, their catholic breadth of treatment, their sound, moderate, practical common sense, and the extent of real learning revealed by the writers. In spite of the deterrents, inseparable from their travels, winter and summer, year in and year out, over scorching desert, stormy, submarine-infested sea, through lands swept by gunfire and pestilence, their passage clogged at times by deluge, Arctic-like cold, mud, dust, blowing red-hot sand, and bodily discomfort unspeakable, these 5 gallant gentlemen pushed sturdily, indomitably forward, and did what was expected of them honestly and thoroughly, without swank, or more than passing slight enumeration of the difficulties encountered, where such mention was necessary to explain the quality of the results achieved. It must be at once conceded that the only way to arrive at a true perception of what the Medical Advisory Committee accomplished in the interests of the health and comfort of our armies in the East is to make careful study of all these reports from beginning to end. Some conception, however, of the scope, the variety, and the far-reaching effect of this committee's labours may be gathered from such general, swift survey of them as is alone possible here. The main official raison d'etre of the committee's existence was to advise as to the prevention of epidemic diseases among the troops. And all their efforts, discursive as they may seem, were really directed against this one fountainhead of military inefficiency. They conceived their mission, limited in words to this one brief, concise phrase, as actually limited alone by the circle of conditions within which bodies of soldiers may move at any period of active service, whether at the base or in the firing line, whether fighting, marching, pent up together in the concentration camps, or lurking in the foxholes of the bivouac, dugout or trench. They realised the dangers to health appertaining to each particular environment, and while thinking en masse, as is alone possible when dealing with vast armies, they yet, as wise men, saw from the beginning that the only way of securing a healthy community was to ensure an unlimited supply of healthy individuals. As a necessary corollary, therefore, the activities of the committee were destined to prove hydra-headed. Their functions being only advisory and not executive, their acts naturally took the form of written reports, addressed to the different Surgeons General, whether of Egypt, Malta, Salonika, or Mesopotamia, within whose jurisdictions they had been labouring. These reports, for the most part, took one set form. Each was divided into 3 heads. First, existing arrangements or conditions in whatever was under investigation were accurately and punctiliously set forth. Then the conditions that ought to exist as a pure matter of principle were detailed. Finally, a series of clear, succinct recommendations was given under the imprimatur of the committee, such recommendations embodying the changes deemed practicable within the limits of unalterable local circumstances. By this systematic procedure in reporting, the committee at one and the same time held up in full view the ideal, recorded the actual, and put in plain practical words the possible, which latter, as it always proves in human affairs, was just a happy give and take between the other two. Merely to record the subjects dealt with in these reports would in itself be a lengthy task. A large number of them were concerned with the salubrity or otherwise of campsites, and the two vital matters of camp sanitation and conservancy. The committee, realising from the first that in what may be called the domestic side of military life lay the principal field for their activities. In regard to Egypt, the conditions under this head were of a very complicated character. Vast bodies of troops were continually arriving in the country, remaining there for various periods, long or short, and then passing on to the different theatres of war. The consequence of this was that a number of very large camps of a more or less permanent nature were established in those parts of the country which were easily accessible to railway or dock. The necessity for having these concentration camps close to the means of transport and to a sufficient supply of good water greatly restricted the military authorities as to choice of site. The troops, therefore, in many instances, were inevitably too closely crowded together, and the sanitary and conservancy difficulties, common to all camps, were thereby largely increased. Sanitation is never wholly a matter of principle. Indeed, in practice, the sanitary enthusiast must be prepared to find all theoretic laws, even those of arithmetic itself, set at defiance. In sanitary science, twice 2 may usually be relied upon to mean 4, but twice 2,000 may yield a wholly disproportionate figure. Arrangements sufficing for a small camp can seldom be made to work for a large one by the simple process of multiplication, and when, as was the case with these large concentration camps in Egypt, the ground was not only continuously occupied by vast bodies of men and animals, but these bodies were periodically changing, and, moreover, the responsibility for the sanitary arrangements incessantly passing into fresh hands, the difficulty of preserving sanitary law and order about each site became a very grave difficulty indeed. On every aspect, then, of this weighty problem, the committee focused the main part of its energy and attention, visiting practically every large camp within the allotted sphere of its influence, and fearlessly having its say on whatever seemed to it in need of reform. A general war against the specific germs of disease may be said to have constituted the next most important item in the committee's programme. This, in its wider sense, includes all measures, such as inoculation, whereby a potentially germ-destructive condition is induced in the human body itself, ready to combat any chance invasion of disease-producing organisms. The committee thoroughly investigated the systems in force in the Army as to this branch of preventive medicine, reported as to their universality, detected and suggested methods for filling in gaps in the vital defensive line, made recommendations as to improvement in quality and nature of the different vaccines or emulsions, and generally infused the whole practice with the latest conceptions of science relating to the subject. It went closely into the existing provision and equipment of base and field laboratories, and the methods of work in force therein, and rendered invaluable service by suggesting possible improvements in systems adopted and appliances used. But it was against the disease germ, which as yet was only a latent power for evil, the myriads of microbes pervading everything the soldier touched or consumed, that the committee's efforts were chiefly directed. In a tropical country the physician soon comes, from dread experience, to regard every single thing, animate or inanimate, with suspicion almost invariably well grounded. The water used by the troops was everywhere subjected to tests, and the best methods for its purification on a large or small scale enumerated. Various new methods for the prevention and destruction of germ-carrying insects were devised. Apparatus in use for the wholesale disinfection of the soldiers' clothing and effects was overhauled, and valuable new appliances introduced. The preservation of food from contamination received all the thought and care it demanded in countries where not only winged pests abounded, but where a highly infective dust or sand continually dwelt upon the air. In this regard, the committee went very closely into the whole kitchen and food handling systems in vogue in the Army at all points, and made them the subjects of many helpful and luminous reports. It also dealt with the serious problem of the existence of vast hordes of native helpers and labourers in proximity to all our camps in the Near East. The difficulty of inducing these folk to conduct their daily lives according to notions of the most elementary sanitary decency, not to mention any sort of real scientific cleanliness, was well nigh insuperable. It had to be tackled, of course. It needed only a breath of wind from the right quarter, blowing over a dirty, neglected native camp, to carry a cloud of infected dust and flies capable of spreading contamination through a whole British division. Here the Argoside Committee rendered yeoman service, going down into the deeps everywhere and unearthing sources of contagion which might well have escaped the regular sanitary inspectors, no matter how conscientiously they held to their task. One very useful capacity in which the committee served during its 2 years' sojourn in the Eastern Mediterranean area is clearly indicated in these reports, although it is little likely to attract general notice. Whenever and wherever in the whole Near Eastern war zone some sharp, serious, inexplicable outbreak of epidemic disease occurred, the committee acted as a sort of breakdown gang or flying squadron, which would proceed immediately to the threatened spot and take expert measures to stamp out the mischief. Over and over again, the services of the committee were utilised by the regular medical authorities in emergencies of this kind, and with uniformly good results. As an instance of this, may be mentioned the sudden mysterious appearance of enterica in the large camp at Moascar, near Ismailia, in the Suez Canal zone, in August of 1916. Within a period of about a fortnight, 23 cases of this intestinal disorder occurred, and the authorities naturally took alarm, as in such a crowded district practically unlimited possibilities for the spread of the disease were ready to hand. The advisory committee was promptly dispatched to the spot, with the result that the cause of the outbreak was immediately discovered in some defective latrines, and what might have developed into a serious trouble happily averted. Again, one of the principal dangers to our troops serving in the East consists in the distressing and probably incurable tropical disease bilharziosis, which has been referred to in previous chapters. That this parasitic disorder has not developed long since into a serious menace to the efficiency of our Near East armies must be entirely set down to the vigilance of the medical authorities. All conceivable precautions against it having been sedulously adopted from the very beginning of hostilities. But isolated instances of the trouble have cropped up from time to time, traceable almost invariably to the neglect of the enjoined simple precautions on the part of the men concerned. The disease, it has been clearly proved, can be acquired by bathing in contaminated water, drinking such water, or even by the handling of fish from an infected stream. In the autumn of 1916, some 20 cases of bilharziosis were detected at an Australian hospital in Cairo, among patients diagnosed as suffering from quite a different complaint. These men all came from one great military camp, and it was obvious that what had occurred to these few might befall many more if the source of infection were not immediately discovered and removed. The advisory committee were at once put on to the case. They interviewed the men and drew from them the admission that, contrary to orders, they had all on one occasion bathed in a certain pool near the camp. Thereupon the committee journeyed to the place, found the pool, detected the bilharzia organisms in it by microscopical examination on the spot, and caused the necessary local measures to be taken to prevent a recurrence of the mischief. In this particular instance of the committee's usefulness, mention may be made of the special difficulty encountered in the work, as throwing a little light on the general conditions of their task. The bilharzia organism lives a particularly complicated life, partly in the water, partly as a parasite of certain species of freshwater snail, and partly within the body of its human or animal host. The exact cycle of the various stages of its life need not be here detailed, but the thorough character of the committee's investigation is evidenced by the fact that they went to the trouble, in regard to this particular pool, of identifying the organism in all its stages, and even determined in what manner the original infection was conveyed to this isolated patch of water, by searching for and discovering human faecal deposits, probably native, in the vicinity in which the characteristic lateral spined ovum of the bilharzia worm was easily demonstrable. It is not, however, possible, nor is it necessary to attempt, within the limited scope of these pages, anything like a complete enumeration of this redoubtable committee's doings. Enough has been said above to show what a real influence for good its members exerted on the health of our troops under all aspects of the campaign. End of section 16. Section 17 of With the Royal Army Medical Corps in Egypt by Sergeant Major R.A.M.C. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16 Military General Hospitals in Egypt, Part 1. The General Hospital forms part of the war establishment of the R.A.M.C, and its normal capacity, as officially laid down, is that of 520 beds, the odd 20 being for sick officers. Its organisation, equipment and personnel are akin to those of the larger military hospitals in time of peace. But the General Hospital has, in addition, the means of supplying to patients, on their discharge, such articles of clothing, equipment and odd necessaries as they may stand in need of. In wartime, it is no unusual thing for a wounded man to arrive at a base hospital shorn of all his previous belongings, or his clothing may have been so completely destroyed as to render it fit only for the incinerator. Of these general hospitals, 2 are officially allotted to each division taking the field. At the time of the outbreak of the present war, there were 2 permanent British Army hospitals in Egypt, that at the Citadel in Cairo and the smaller one at Ras El Tin, overlooking the harbour of Alexandria. These, however, were equipped only on a peace footing, with 250 and 120 beds respectively. We have already described how, under the stress of the Gallipoli crisis, the hospital system at the Egyptian base of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force was so established and developed as ultimately to reach a capacity of many thousand beds. Buildings of all sorts had to be acquired for the service of the wounded and sick in one form or another. In all, 23 permanent buildings, 9 hotels, 2 places of entertainment, 7 schools, 4 Egyptian army barracks and 14 private houses were pressed into the service, and 1 large camp hospital under canvas was installed. This list, however, does not include certain convalescent depots, such as that at Montazar, which alone took over 1,000 patients each. There is, perhaps, no more exacting work in the whole Army Medical Service than that which falls upon the staff of a general hospital, especially under climatic conditions such as obtain in Egypt. In an earlier chapter, that dealing with the time of the Dardanelles avalanche of wounded to the Egyptian base, an attempt was made to record what sort and measure of duty devolved upon our men and women alike under circumstances of urgency, perhaps unparalleled in the medical history of the war. But even under the normal busy conditions, such as have existed in Egypt almost without a break since that memorable time, the work in a general hospital is trying to the last degree. Monotony, which is static, which consists in a ceaseless even round of small duties, none of them making any great demand on energy or interest, is bearable because the mind is free to wing away at any moment into realms of compensating thought. But monotony, which is one never halting press of duties treading hard upon each other's heels, duties by turns brain and body wearying, heart aching or soul sickening, a day-long and night-long giddy whirligig of sameness that gives one scarce time to eat or breathe or close a tired eye on a world that seems all suffering, sorrow, bloodshed, death, the man or woman who can plod serenely, stalwartly on through, day after day, month after month of such a life, must be made of more than mortal tegument. He or she must be qualifying for a saint's aureola, and few there be of that ilk in the ranks of the R.A.M.C. It is not pretended that life in the huge base hospitals of Egypt was always moving at this ding-dong pace. There were intervals between the arrivals of the convoys of wounded when the work eased up to such a degree as almost to create a feeling of leisure among the white-gowned orderly crew. But such moments were all too rare. Generally, the great busy organism fared along like a powerful, well-oiled locomotive pulling a heavy load, sometimes straining and puffing at a steep gradient, sometimes swooping easily downward, but for the most part driving steadily forward at top gauge pressure through hill and dale, the common give and take of busy days. The object of these pages being the presentation of an account, as complete as may be, of what the Royal Army Medical Corps did in Egypt during the Great War, it is necessary to deal at some length and in considerable detail with the subject of General Hospitals, seeing what a conspicuous part these played in the conflict from first to last. Perhaps, however, tedium to the reader can be avoided, and the desired object equally attained, if the story be allowed to tell itself through the medium of certain extracts from a diary kept by an orderly who was continuously employed in one of these base hospitals during the most stirring period of the war. As far as possible, where all did so splendidly, the names of individual workers have hitherto been omitted from this chronicle, and it is not necessary to depart from this wholesome rule in the present instance. It will suffice, if it be mentioned, that the operating theatre orderly, whose diary is here quoted at length, was well trained in all branches of R.A.M.C. work, and capable of an accurate estimation of and deduction from facts. It is needful to bear this in mind, as the extracts in question not only deal with the work done, but constitute, in some measure, an independent, just, and, it must be owned, rather intrepid criticism of certain of the conditions under which it was accomplished. The writer, however, may well be left to make good, or otherwise, on his own account. The operating theatre of a big military hospital in wartime is, in a sense, the eyes and ears of the place. There is little that happens in the whole hospital that you do not see or get to know. As theatre orderly, your work takes you into almost every ward or department at one time or another, and the business of most of the other orderlies in the building brings them to the theatre on various occasions. We hear the surgeons talk between the cases, and thus get a sort of second edition of matters discussed at the officers' mess. The theatre sister's bosom friends or enemies come to visit her in odd hours of leisure, and volubly and voluminously unburden themselves of the latest rumours in feminine R.A.M.C. affairs. The patients talk to us, telling us weird tales from the firing line that would never do for the papers, but through it all, we ourselves, as the surgeons' orderlies, and thus the creme de la creme of the hospital orderly class, maintain an attitude of immaculate discretion. We are at once exemplars of reticence and receptiveness. We are like the closed wooden money boxes of our schoolboy days, quick to engulf coin, but slow to yield it up again, even to the exploratory persuasion of a dinner knife. The inveterate gossip, though cautious men of the world do not emulate him, has nevertheless his part to play. Unintentionally, and for his own easement, he livens the dry dust of your day's work, just as the full-cropped bird of passage may cause the far mountain peak to clothe itself with verdure, or the desert to blossom like the rose. They have been tremendously busy in the surgical wards to day, and that is sure to mean hard work in the theatre to morrow, and for many days to come. Very early a big convoy of wounded arrived from the front. A whole fleet of motor ambulances suddenly invaded the quiet of the hospital square in the blue dusk of dawn, all loudly trumpeting like a stampeding herd of elephants. Directly the first vehicle turned the corner in the ghostly light, The bell clanged out to summon all GDOs to the work of carrying the cases up to the wards. I stood midway along the great main corridor and watched the stream of laden stretchers flowing by. It is hard work, stretcher bearing, and none but the youngest and strongest can keep on with it for any length of time. I know, because I have done my share of it in the past, until I got PB'd for shell shock, and the desert and I parted company for ever. I wonder if anyone at home, even the great DG himself, quite realises the amount and variety of heavy work that ordinarily falls upon an R.A.M.C. man on active service. Stretcher bearing forms only a single part of it. On a battlefield, you often have to deal with a wounded man single-handed, get him unaided upon your own back, and carry him to the zone of safety, maybe a quarter of a mile away or more. Then a field ambulance moves with an unavoidable mass of necessarily heavy things: tents, medical and surgical panniers, bedding and what not. All these must be loaded and unloaded, tents pitched and struck, the water and food needed by the patients and staff fetched and carried, animals and vehicles cared for, cleansed. Scarce anything we do but needs muscle as well as mind. I stood and watched the steadily flowing stream of wounded men that passed by me in the dawning yellow light, and wondered how much energy and hard work had been expended in the task of bringing them into this haven of succour and security. The last sunbeam of yesterday had probably seen them lying out amid the sandhills of Sinai, 100 miles away, helpless, maimed and torn. Now, before the sun could get another look at them, they were back in the midst of law and order once more. One little army of Red Cross men had contrived this laborious miracle for them. Here was another waiting, all the resources of medical service at its beck and call, to do more miracles in their service. Kind eyes, soft voices, gentle, clever hands, comfort and spotless cleanliness, order and quietude, fresh plucked flowers blooming and waving near open windows, a scent of new linen on the air, the first sunbeams of the summer's morning, like Jacob's ladders of gold dust, gridding the tidy wards. How, I bethought me, should all this, the first impression of a general hospital, strike a wounded, helpless man, who but yesterday was brutishly blood-giving and blood-taking under the roar of cannon and reek of battle smoke? There were a couple of hundred in the convoy, perhaps, and each man had to be got to bed, his clothes gently drawn or cut from him, his body washed, splints and bandages readjusted perhaps, food given, his small personal belongings, if he had any, neatly arranged in the locker by his bedside, his hospital kit drawn for him, his military equipment taken to the pack store and there left until he was well enough to reclaim it, or until it was certain he would need it no more. Then came the medical inspection. The doctor visited each bed in turn and made a thorough examination of the case, deciding on future treatment. The cases were of all degrees of gravity. Some needed only care and rest and nourishment to give nature all the chance she asked for. Others required close attention, the constant vigilance of doctor and nursing staff through long weeks, perhaps, before the patient would have drawn away from the danger line. Others required special complicated appliances and apparatus. Here and there a man was marked down for operation as soon as the busy theatre could find time to deal with him, or as soon as his strength had been raised to the necessary point of endurance. And all of them meant increasing care and hard work for the orderlies, sisters, and nurses of the ward, dressing and bandaging, blanket bathing, the preparation and administration of food and medicine, constant sanitary service, the preservation of cleanliness everywhere, the 101 nameless little officers due to the helpless sick. And then there were the special things dictated by the subtropical climate in which we were working. It was bad enough to have to endure bodily pain. It was too much to have to put up with the added torment of heat and dust, flies and mosquitoes. Little could be done to mitigate the heat. That is when it was really hot in Cairo, 120 degrees or so in the shade. But the dust storms could be somewhat mitigated by wire-meshed screens over windows and doors, and mosquito nets over the beds would do the rest. In special cases also the fan was a potent vehicle of mercy, in our hospital at least. On some brazen, breathless afternoon I have passed through a ward and seen a fan steadily going over a flushed, half-conscious face, maybe that of a man just reviving from an operation, and returning, perhaps an hour after, there would be the fan still at work, a woman doing it very likely, but just as often one of the orderlies. A man soon learns the trick of delicacy in these little things, and of course he can keep on much longer at the job. If in the surgical wards of a general hospital the work of an R.A.M.C. orderly is trying enough with its incessant nerve-harrowing crises and ghastly scenes, it is perhaps even more so in the medical division. Every hospital orderly by nature and temperament falls into one or the other of these two great categories, surgical or medical, and the qualifications requisite for each are wide as the poles asunder. You cannot make a good surgical orderly out of one whose tendencies and abilities naturally belong to the medical side, while any attempt to bend one trained in surgical nursing to the meticulous round of medical affairs is but to waste time and good human material. For medical ward work you must have a natural love of routine, a memory as exact and unfailing as a ship's chronometer, and a tireless, cheery patience. And then I am not sure that you will last long at the job unless you are further equipped with a sense of humour of the hardy perennial kind, or at least a lively appreciation of the grotesque. You will need this humour to preserve your sanity. The women in hospital work, at least in tropical countries, are wiser than we are. They keep themselves mentally salubrious by a periodical letting off of steam. They run amok, so to say, among the gentler sex, their male coadjutors, get the necessary reaction pirate-wise somehow or other, emerge smiling, rejuvenated, ready again for peace and quiet, forgetfulness and forgiveness, such as the hammer may be supposed to feel towards the nail after the due amount of clamorous collision. You must not mind sparks, nor what produces them, if your life as an orderly in a general hospital ward is to be worth the living. But that is another story, which needs a different mood from that which besets me now. I will jot down somewhat about it later, in its place. No, I do not envy the medical orderly his job. the more I see of it, the more thoroughly it fills me with something very like aversion. I can do anything for a wounded man, but a sick man somehow chills me off. It is a psychological matter, I think. Sickness, disease, are abnormalities. Perhaps they are the fruit of demoniac obsessions in the real biblical sense. Who can certainly deny it? At least they change a man physically, mentally, almost spiritually, one might say, while their sway is over him. A man is not himself when in their clutches. Who or what else he is, belike we shall never really know. The day's round of duty in a medical ward is indeed a round, the ring to which there is neither end nor beginning. For, if you take your work to heart, you can never wholly separate yourself from it, whether your spell of duty comes by day or night. You come on duty at, say, 6 o'clock in the morning, and find the night orderlies preternaturally wide awake, bustling about in the early sunshine, taking temperatures or lingering over little odd jobs, loath even then to break the spell of action that is on them and be away to their beds. There is that curious heavy atmosphere in the ward that dwells over sleeping men at night and never over sleeping men by day. The night sister is still in the bunk. You can see her through the open door, busy over her report, and displaying an alabaster-like prettiness under the pure white virgin light of the morning. She is in no hurry to go either. The junior orderlies, just up fresh from early roll call, are already on their knees in a row at the far end of the ward. It is scrubbing day to-day, and the whole ward must be cleaned through before breakfast. The harsh chorus of the scrubbing brushes and swish of the water join with the glad note of the birds that comes in through the open windows from the garden outside. As orderly in charge, you walk down the long rows of beds and take a look at each patient in turn, exchanging a word with those who are awake. This is a time of alternate pleasure and keen disappointment. Cases you well nigh despaired of overnight have, perhaps, taken a wonderful turn for the better. Others who were improving have lost ground, temperature up again, all the odd perilous signs alight once more in wandering eye and flushed, congested face. And perhaps a form lies uncannily still and silent under the blue counterpane in the far corner. The watching orderly nods grimly as you approach. You take one quick look at the waxen mask on the pillow, then draw the screens about the bed. Sharply you tell the orderly to fetch the stretcher squad, and sharply you admonish another man hard by, who indeed is doing his work well enough. To lose a case is the most trying, irritating thing of all. Does anyone at home, I mean among the plain workaday men and women in the street, really know what sick nursing in a hot subtropical country like Egypt actually means? Who has any more idea of it, beyond the old pretty popular fancy of measuring out medicine 3 times a day, cooling a fevered brow with lavender water, and sticking a few roses in a bedside vase? All these things and many more are done, of course, by the ministering angels of an R.A.M.C. hospital ward in the East, and pleasant it is, truly, to see the ladies of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service and the Voluntary Aid Detachments flitting about a ward in their spotless white aprons and dainty caps, carrying a sense of decent order and decorum wherever they go. No one knows, or is more ready to acknowledge the real value of, nay, the absolute necessity for, the presence of a female nursing staff in a military hospital at all times, than the writer of these lines. If we orderlies did not fully and frankly acknowledge this, there are thousands of grateful soldier patients in the army who would soon set the public right in the matter. But what the public does not know, and what it is our right and our duty to tell them, is that practically all the hard work, and assuredly all the dirty work, of a hospital ward is done by the male nursing staff of the R.A.M.C. And what work it often is! It is difficult in a publication designed for the general reader, where technical phrases must be avoided, to convey a true impression of this matter without going into revolting details. But a few guarded, necessarily scanty words must be essayed. Despite all sanitary precautions in the field, many thousands of our troops were attacked by bowel disorders, enteric fever, dysentery, and the like. The greater number of these were helpless, bedridden cases, involving a constant care of the most intimate personal kind. Not only had each patient to be maintained in a state of cleanliness as regards his person and everything with which he came in contact, but where his complaint was infectious, all sorts of antiseptic precautions had to be scrupulously observed. Dejecta had to be disposed of in certain ways medically laid down. Utensils, garments and bed linen had to be antiseptically treated, this rule also applying to the wards themselves and everything they contained. To put the matter in plain words, the orderlies in charge of these cases had literally to be elbow deep in filth of a highly dangerous kind, morning, noon and night. This element of danger in nursing cases of infectious disease must not be overlooked. It applies, of course, in a great degree to the doctors and female staff of the wards, but it is the orderlies who have all the dirty work to do, who run the principal risk, as our corps records of sickness amply show. And yet there is never any difficulty in securing volunteers among them for emergency duty when outbreaks of exceptionally fatal diseases such as smallpox and cholera occur. The fine spirit shown by our men in this regard during the whole of the Egyptian campaign has been beyond all praise. To be shut up in an isolation ward for weeks and months on end, doggedly enduring a life such as no malefactor ever had meted out to him by an outraged law, and doing it cheerfully, faithfully, to the end, is just to behave like a hero. There is no other word to fit the case. It would not be a bad idea if a special decoration were instituted for men and women of this stamp, and it might be called the Father Damien Order. I know many a one who would deserve it, and get it too, if deserts had all to do with its award. Much the same need of incessant dabbling in loathsomeness obtains in the surgical division of a hospital, where so many perfectly helpless cases are continually under treatment. And here there is the element of the horrible, added to that of the revolting. I am not saying that a surgical orderly normally goes about with his heart in his mouth. He would be of little service if he did. Personally, long use has so accustomed me to the sight and handling of shattered and yet living human bodies, that there is, I believe, no terrible thing of this kind which could break my nerve. But all the same, experience does not lessen, rather it heightens, sensitiveness. The more you see of war's terrible work, though you are the more sternly tempered, the more you dread it. The more you see of suffering, the more you suffer with it, and the more sternly capable in the work of its assuagement you become. I have said that the climate has a deal of influence over hospital work in Egypt. Only those who have lived the year through in a hospital here can fully realise what that influence is. In Egypt, even in midwinter, the days are always warm so long as the sun is up. It is only the nights that are cold, sometimes bitterly cold. The Egyptian winter is very short, however. Both days and nights for the greater part of the year are hot, with a peculiar dead, dry, scorching heat that is particularly trying to sick and well alike. And there is always an impalpable dust in the air that even on the stillest days steadily collects upon everything, a dust that in all probability is capable of carrying the germs of almost every known disease. When the wind gets up, the dust gets up with it, and the harder the wind blows, the more dust it brings. The dust storms in Cairo must be classed among the most unpleasant things that it is possible to conceive. But there is something still worse that the old Arab city keeps for us when in its most venomous mood. The heat alone is bearable, and heat and dust together keep ordinarily just within the limit of human endurance. But when a great sandstorm comes raging in upon the city off the desert, and heat, dust and sand unite their forces against poor humanity, then the stoutest heart may well grow faint. I always pity the white women, and especially the little, pale, peaky English children of Cairo at these times. If ever there was a time when an orderly should not answer back in counter to unreasoning feminine assailment, it is this. Many have attempted to describe a really bad sandstorm over Cairo city, and in spite of heaping ossa upon pelion of ejaculation and superlative, have wholly failed to convey an idea of the real thing. I am not going to enter the futile competition. I can only put in bald words how the thing strikes me. Suppose all Egypt were made of brass, and suppose the sun gradually, through many portentous days and nights, developed enough furnace heat to bring this brass first to the melting point, and then to dissolve it into lambent yellow vapour. And then suppose all the winds of heaven to join together in one mighty hurricane to gather up all the sands of the Sahara to itself, and hurl vapour and sand together in one incessant red-hot, resounding avalanche upon the town. Then you will get some notion, maybe a trifle exaggerated, of what Cairo is like in a typical summer sandstorm. Khamsin, Haboob, or whatever you choose to call the infernal thing. Now conceive yourself one of the medical staff in a big military hospital, full of sick and wounded, trying to preserve some degree of decency and comfort among the patients under these conditions. The sand and dust are everywhere. Closed windows and doors are of no avail against them. They drive in through every chink and crevice, and smother everything, patients, food, floors, furniture, all alike. A deep yellow twilight looms over the city, such as London never saw in its palmiest days of November fog. The electric lights have been switched on in the wards all the morning, and added to this, the wind outside keeps up a dreadful, hollow, banshee-like wail, and makes every door and casement and skylight in the hospital rattle savagely, so that you can scarce hear a human voice a dozen yards away. Of course, these full-dress visitations of the elements are not of every day. They are, indeed, rare, one or two at most in a season. But once experienced, they are never to be forgotten. It is small wonder the Israelites were keen on getting out of Egypt. I am keen enough that way myself sometimes. It is in the wards, of course, that the great bulk of the outward obvious work of a general hospital is done. But there is a vast amount of other work, equally necessary, which the R.A.M.C. staff has to get through daily, but which does not meet the eye of the casual visitor. Take the quartermaster's department as a first instance. Generally speaking, we have no use for the genius in the Army Medical Service. We form together, so to speak, a great machine, concerning whose composition it is of vital importance that every one of its parts should be of exact gauge and flawless metal, but in which a single part of superlative merit is nowhere needed. But there is one exception to this rule. The quartermaster of a great military hospital in wartime should be a genius in his own particular line. All our quartermasters in Egypt must have been so, or the hospital service could never have held up, as it has done, against the mammoth strain to which it has been subjected. This hospital of ours is by no means one of the biggest, and yet in 1 year alone, 1915, we took in thousands of cases. All these people, as well as the large R.A.M.C. staff, had to be fed. Every patient had to be provided with bed linen needing frequent change, a suit of hospital clothes, and a long list of odd necessaries. On discharge, all deficiencies in his service kit had to be made good. Often this meant an entire new rig-out of clothing. The hospital required innumerable things: furniture, utensils, cooking gear, household materials and implements, and the like, most of which needed periodical renewal. And everything, except a few perishable foodstuffs, had to be obtained from home, some 3,000 miles overseas. I take off my hat to the quartermasters of the R.A.M.C. That they have done what they have done is obvious, in the face of the accomplished fact. But how it has all been accomplished fairly beats me. Then there are the clinical laboratories and the X-ray rooms. To the laboratories go numerous specimens of blood, sputum, faeces, etc., for microscopical examination and bacteriological treatment. In our own little way here, taking the same year as before, we dealt with some 4,000 or 5,000 different specimens. Anyone conversant with laboratory procedure will realise the vast amount of work involved in this. Each specimen has to be carefully prepared and treated before the microscope will yield any information about it. It may have to be subjected to various reagents and several kinds of bacterial stains. Cultures on different media at certain definite temperatures will have to be made and examined at stated intervals. All has to be done under strict aseptic conditions, so that no alien element may intrude itself and vitiate the result. the most simply equipped laboratory requires a bewilderingly extensive array of instruments and apparatus, not to mention the brains needed to use them. Moreover, a laboratory requires other things just as indispensable to the main object of its existence, which is the saving of human life by prompt recognition of disease. There must be little in the daily round of a military telegraph operator's life to relieve the grave tedium of his task. But I wonder if the man who sent the following wire, dispatched post haste one morning, detected a glimmer of humour in it, coming as it must have done in the midst of an ocean of important messages bearing the grisly impress of war. The message ran, "Please send 12 guinea pigs by special messenger. Urgent." A touch of the like-saving grace may have appeared in the reply. "Regret having run out of guinea pigs, owing to great demand for Mesopotamia. How about rabbits?" The X-ray room at a general hospital does for a wounded man much what the laboratory does for a sick one. It supplies at once vital information as to his state, which probably could not otherwise be obtained in time. The location of a bullet, or buried fragment of projectile, or the precise nature and extent of a bone fracture, if early ascertained, may make all the difference to the injured man's chance of recovery, or at least save him from an infinity of suffering. Recourse is therefore had to the Röntgen rays before every operation for extraction of foreign bodies, where the making of a skiograph is in any way practicable. Having the photograph, or rather the shadowgraph of the injured part before him in the theatre for constant reference, the surgeon is able to cut down straight to the bullet or whatever may be embedded in the tissues, without making unnecessary incisions or spending time in exploration. In the case of the fracture of a bone, the X-ray picture enables a definite procedure to be decided on, and all necessary preparations made beforehand, and the patient is thus saved the risk of prolonged subjection to anaesthetics. In many injuries involving fracture, the parts are so swollen and tender as to render any bedside examination in the ordinary way entirely out of the question, and the patient therefore would come to the operating table with practically nothing known of his real state but for the help of the X-rays. The dispensary is another department of a general hospital where a vast amount of work is done. Though the medicines prescribed in the wards are standardised as far as possible, the usual combinations of drugs are subject to continual variation to suit the needs of the different cases, and to accord with the ideas of different medical officers, so that stock mixtures can be employed in only limited degree. In addition, an enormous number of special drugs have to be kept in readiness, and the list of these is continually extending. The same applies to surgical instruments and appliances, all of which pass through the dispensing department of a hospital. Of instruments, their name is legion. It is amazing what the development of modern surgery has rendered absolutely necessary in this way, even in a field surgical outfit designed for use close up to the firing line, while the surgical equipment of an operating theatre in a great base hospital has reached truly astounding proportions. This is equally the case with all kinds of surgical and medical material, specially devised splints for each variety of fracture, bandages of all shapes, widths and species of fabric, dressings plain or antiseptic, surgical lotions of all imaginable kinds. In regard to splints and special appliances necessary for the support of fractured limbs, so great a demand for these arose in Egypt that the medical authorities established a factory in Alexandria where all such articles could be made and served out to the various units immediately, thus avoiding the delays which so often occurred in awaiting supplies from home. This factory was started in May 1915, and eventually 20 or 30 carpenters, metal workers and saddlers found continuous employment there. First intended to supply only the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, its products eventually came to be distributed to most of the war centres in the Near East. Besides turning out large quantities of splints of the regulation patterns, it was particularly useful as a place where any special appliance could be promptly manufactured to the design and specification of medical officers throughout the war area. There is a department, common to most general hospitals, which is euphemistically termed the lavage room. It is actually a special surgery and dispensary attended by all patients suffering from venereal diseases, who are undergoing a periodical course of treatment. Here a very considerable amount of really hard and invariably disgusting work is done by the R.A.M.C. personnel attached to the branch. Dangerous work, too, as many a surgeon and orderly has found out to his cost. But the work must be done by someone, and it is tackled by our men with the same sang-froid, readiness and patient skill shown by them in all other activities of the Corps. It is not necessary here to go into details of the work of the lavage room. It involves many minor surgical operations, the carrying out of many intravenous and intramuscular injections, and a sharp supervision over a variety of matters of a personal kind. Closely allied with the work of the lavage room is that appertaining to the venereal wards. That these wards are practically detention compounds is a fact upon which no other comment need here be made than that experience has proved it to be a necessary fact, and one which adds inordinately to the difficulties of the staff employed. It is easy to criticise the whole present scheme of treatment of venereal patients in the Army, but not so easy to suggest amendments. At least it is certain that all that can be done in the stress and hurry of wartime is being done in Egypt. But this, and the whole group of social questions from which it arises, will have to be reopened and drastically reconsidered hereafter as a national concern. It would be well if it were placed in the hands of a strong commission from which all lecture room cranks and Puritan visionaries will have been rigorously excluded, and in which none but practical, level-headed, large-hearted, far-seeing Christian men of a practical Christian world will have any say or sway. And such a commission ought to be given power to act. I am not addicted to italics as a rule, but I feel the need for them here. The Army today will be the nation tomorrow. If it be true, as one military surgeon of long experience declared in my hearing, that when our soldiers return from war, 10 out of every 100 of them will be tainted with venereal disease, it is a tremendous fact that brooks no dissembling. The trumpet call that heralds peace must be for us as a nation, but a call to another war that will need more than strenuous waging if we mean to keep our place on earth. End of section 17. Section 18 of With the Royal Army Medical Corps in Egypt by Sergeant Major R.A.M.C. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16 Military General Hospitals in Egypt, Part 2. Looking through the odd casual jottings of this notebook, it strikes me as curious that I have never yet set down anything about my own special sphere of work, that of orderly in the operating theatre. Perhaps this is because, seeing so much of it all day and every day, and often during the night, I am glad enough to forget it when I am off duty, and can sit for a while in the barrack room window, as I am doing now, smoking and scribbling in my lap. Our theatre here can be taken as a type of the theatres in all other general hospitals in Egypt, except that, as it does not belong to one of the largest hospitals, its statistics of work done are probably below the average figures. Even with this proviso, our record for a year, the year 1915, is a sufficiently remarkable one. In that period we performed 1,160 major operations. These were mainly for injuries received in battle, but included many of the ordinary type, such as operations for the cure of rupture, appendicitis, hemorrhoids and the like. The surgical work was performed by various surgeons, but the rest of the work appertaining to the theatre was entirely carried through by 4 people: the sister in charge, a staff nurse, and 2 orderlies. There is a great deal more to do in an operating theatre than wielding the knife. To begin with, the theatre itself, its whole interior, floor, walls, windows, doors, ceiling, and every article of furniture it contains, must be thoroughly washed at frequent intervals and treated with antiseptics. Not a speck of dust or dirt that could harbour a microbe can be tolerated for a moment in a modern operating theatre. Then the science of asepsis, perfect surgical cleanliness, must be studied in all its endless ramifications by everyone concerned, and its dictates punctiliously carried out in practice. All that the surgeons use or wear, or that comes into contact with the area of operation, must be sterilised. Sharp instruments are steeped in antiseptic solution, blunt instruments are boiled. Dressing gauze, lint, swabs, towels, sheets, overalls, and all other textile articles are treated in the high-pressure steam steriliser. The surgeons wear rubber gloves, armlets, caps, masks, gowns and aprons, all of which must be sterilised and renewed, of course, at each operation. Every utensil employed, bowls, jugs, dishes, trays, odd glassware and chinaware of various kinds, must be subjected to the like process. And it must all be done over again and over again for ever. All the antiseptic cleaning and steeping and boiling and firing and steam sterilising and renewal of every single thing used or even touched during one operation, before the next operation can be taken in hand. And not only has the theatre staff to carry out all these multifarious and difficult duties, but it has, in our theatre at least, the patients to prepare for their ordeal, and always the actual operation to superintend throughout. It has to attend to the anaesthetist and provide him with all he requires, no light task in itself. Finally, it must convey the patient back to the ward and deliver him to the ward sister, together with final instructions from the operating surgeon, the responsibility of the theatre ceasing only when the unconscious man is safely delivered into bed and is seen to be under proper surveillance. It may be interesting to the reader if these rough notes, set down at odd moments in a busy life, ever achieve the dignity of print, to run over the routine of an average day in an operating theatre. It will, at any rate, serve to show what this branch of R.A.M.C. work actually amounts to under the special conditions prevailing in Egypt. In our theatre, each day's work really began overnight. The orderlies would receive the list of intended operations for the morrow, and would then bring each patient to the theatre in turn for the necessary preparation. Or, if the patient's condition was too critical for him to be moved, the orderly would have to take all his material to the bedside, and there carry out what was required. The theory of this preparation was that the site of the proposed incision, together with a large surrounding area, should be rendered bacteriologically clean and kept so for 10 or 12 hours previous to the operation, so that by no possibility could toxic matter be carried in by the knife. The area of the operation had first to be carefully shaved. Then it was thoroughly swabbed by 3 different antiseptic lotions, each having special bactericidal properties. Finally, this area was covered up with sterile lint, the lint being bandaged securely in place. The whole work had to be carried out under the same aseptic conditions as if the operation were being actually performed. It was a point of emulation with us to carry through these overnight preparations with all the celerity possible, consistent with the thorough performance of the work, as indeed was necessary with a long list of such preparations before us. But even then the whole evening was fully taken up. An average of half an hour given to each case would represent a pretty good night's performance. Many of the cases could not possibly be prepared in this time. Take, for instance, that wherein excision of varicose veins from both legs was contemplated, and the surgeon, as was usual, had ordered abdominal preparation. This meant that the entire body from the ankles up to about 3 inches above the navel had to be shaved, treated with the lotions, and covered and bandaged, as described above. The day's work in the theatre commenced at 6 o'clock in the morning, when the whole place, already spotlessly, distressingly clean, an outsider might say, received a thorough mopping and damp dusting with cloths wrung out in cresol solution. The various boilers and sterilisers were set going. The theatre was laid out with all necessaries for the first operation, a long list of articles, each having its preordained traditional place. A typical programme for a day's work in our theatre would be, say, 1 major amputation, an appendicitis case, 2 or 3 inguinal hernias or hemorrhoids, a bullet extraction or 2 with perhaps a screen case, a phimosis or kindred operation to follow. In addition to these, there might be, and generally was, an emergency operation brought in at any moment, and before which all else would have to give way. A favourite time, however, for these emergency cases was the small hours of the morning. to fling out of bed in the dead dark of night, rush down to the theatre, and set all going pell-mell for a critical operation, an amputation, trephining, intestinal stoppage, or what not, was no unusual experience in our work as theatre orderlies. And a malicious fate generally arranged matters so that these portentous times came at the end of the hardest day's work in the week, when there had been left to you only sufficient energy to drop your clothes on the floor and crawl into bed, dizzy and faint with interminable hours of duty. But a theatre orderly, worthy of the name, never really minds these emergency calls. It is saying a good deal, but there is probably more pride, more esprit de corps among the theatre orderly class than in any branch of the R.A.M.C. service. We know our responsibility, nay, indispensability, and keep a pretty stiff neck accordingly. Conceit and gunpowder between them will go far to win any war. In these operating theatres attached to the great base hospitals in Egypt, we have tried to reproduce, as nearly as may be, the exact methods of procedure appertaining to the best theatres at home, but we have not quite succeeded. The climate makes its influence felt at every turn, and modifies conditions, sometimes very materially. The surgeon fresh out from home has a deal to learn before he becomes used to things. The excessive dryness of the air at all times, the phenomenal heat of summer, and the eternal dust create together a new situation. It may take, for instance, a whole 20-ounce bottle of ether, if that anaesthetic alone be used, to keep a man under for the length of an ordinary operation. The heat, too, in a theatre, despite all precautions, is often appalling, with the thermometer standing at 115 or 120 degrees in the shade. To have to dress up in waterproof apron, thick linen gown, rubber gloves and armlets, mask and cap, is something that may well appal a newcomer. Then the flies and other winged torments of Egypt are not to be wholly excluded from the theatre by any means that ingenuity can devise. A few are sure to find their way in, where doors are so frequently opening and shutting. A surgeon trussed up in the way described is wholly at the mercy of any evil-disposed fly who chooses to assail the small portion of his face which is necessarily left uncovered. He is perfectly helpless against his tormentor. He dare not brush it off, as his hands are sterile, and his face and the fly are very much the reverse. His sole chance of deliverance lies in a watchful orderly, and it is no exaggeration to say that, with 2 or perhaps 3 surgeons and a charge sister all sterile, and therefore a helpless prey to attacking insects, our day's work was materially increased by continual fly-killing forays. I have seen a very eminent surgeon, a great gun from Harley Street attached to the R.A.M.C. for the duration, fairly beside himself with impotent rage at a fly which was clinging to his eyelid, and thus entirely stopping him in the task of plating a fractured femur. Nor were the flies our sole source of anxiety in this way. Perspiration was equally a bête noire with us. The subject verges on the ridiculous, but its serious side is not to be gainsaid. Surgical work, especially when an amputation is in progress, is often very hard work indeed, and, swaddled up as he is, with the thermometer at 100 degrees or so, the surgeon is sure to perspire profusely. As is well known, perspiration is highly septic, and should a drop by any chance fall into the incision, the consequences might be serious. Life itself might easily be lost in that way. Herein dwells a fearful responsibility for the orderly. He must silently pervade the scene, towel in hand, and woe betide him if he fail in his duty. One particular surgeon, whose bad habit it was to operate without the usual mask, used to be the terror of all concerned in this way. He was a man of a generous habit of life, and moreover a trifle short-sighted, so that his custom was to bend much over the case. Many a time I have caught the agonised eye of the charge sister, and rushed up with a towel just in time to prevent disaster. We soon developed an acrobatic agility at this game, but it had its use in leavening somewhat the over-tragic side of our employment. Who would look to the operating theatre of a hospital to provide a spectacle that, on a small scale, may be said to rival Irving's celebrated staging of the scene on the Brocken? And yet such a spectacle does come, and not infrequently, in the round of a day's theatre work. Sometimes a bullet or shell fragment is embedded in a man's body in such a situation as to render the taking of an X-ray photograph impracticable. In this case, the operation for the extraction or other foreign matter may be performed in the X-ray room itself, and then ensues a scene which, for lurid picturesqueness, would be hard to equal in any kind of theatre. Here is the scene, as nearly as a somewhat stubbly pencil end may serve to reproduce it. The room is large, but lit only by a single electric bulb, a sort of robber's cave hung round with innumerable weird appliances, over which play the shadows of those grouped about the central table. The table is of wood, a sort of sarcophagus, with a pane of glass let into its side. The subject lies naked on the table, with the anaesthetist at his head, now engaged in administering the chloroform. Round the table stand half a dozen silent, motionless forms, completely concealed in robes and headdresses of white linen, like a band of Druid priests at some dreadful prehistoric rite. We do not talk, because speech would serve us little in the din that is going on. A great dynamo is blaring and burring in the corner. Another electric contrivance of fantastic shape stands upon a high pedestal near by. It utters one long unearthly screech, loudly clacking a myriad tongues the while. Outside the room, a gas engine proclaims its existence sonorously. There is a rush and ripple of water somewhere in the background. It would be useless to talk when none could hear. What intercommunication is necessary between us from time to time is carried on by signs and gestures. At last, as we wait in the dim ghostly light, the anaesthetist looks up and nods to the surgeon. The surgeon nods to the X-ray operator. The latter turns to his apparatus, falling to work upon certain handles and levers. Out goes the light, and we are left for a space in utter darkness. And then we are all suddenly transported to the diabolical precincts of the scene from Faust. Across the darkness overhead shoot out long cloven tongues of vivid blue, whiplashes of steel blue light flickering and swaying everywhere. Then through the glass of the table springs up another light, this time of a pale absinthe green, which in a moment floods the whole room, illuminating its remotest recesses. But it does more than that. It does a thing which is perfectly horrifying to one witnessing it for the first time. It enables you to see through a man. The case on the table is one of a bullet lodged near the lung. We see the man himself now made apparently of semi-transparent green jelly, wherein we can dimly trace the form and order of his ribs, a jumble of heaving vague shapes within, which are heart, lungs, and other vessels, and low down in the muscular tissue, opposite the base of one lung, a mysterious dark oblong patch which we know to be a Turkish bullet. The surgeon takes his scalpel in hand. His work is comparatively simple now. Half an hour later, the senseless, stertorously breathing man is on his way back to the ward, free of a danger that had like to have meant festering death to him, or at least a source of discomfort, disability, journeying with him to his grave. Sister Z and I had words last night, or rather we should have done if I had not promptly put on my old and well-tried suit of mail, of a genial but scrupulously respectful silence, when she descended upon me like a queen hornet disturbed from her nest. The theatre was filthy, she cried. The floor like a pigsty, everything smothered in dust and dirt. She was perfectly ashamed of the place. It wasn't safe to do as much as dress a cut finger in it. She flounced off into the sterilising room with a tempestuous rustle of petticoats. A moment later she was calling me angrily. "Just look at the brasses," quoth she. "I don't believe they have been touched for a week, and the cobwebs black upon the ceiling, and the foul linen not yet seen to, and all this rubbish lying about. What you lazy men do with your time fairly beats me." I looked round and saw my face reflected a dozen times in the unsullied splendour of nickel-plated dressing-drum and copper urn. There was no sign of a cobweb that I could see. The linen was still drying after its bath of cresol, and therefore could not yet be dealt with. The rubbish was something she had herself left and forgotten about. But, like the tar baby, I kept on saying nothing. Presently she fell to pacing up and down the room, twisting her handkerchief into tight little knots behind her. At last it all came out, as I knew it would. "That laparotomy of B ward has gone septic," she explained, making a furious dab at her eyes with the handkerchief. "And Captain Q says, but I am perfectly sure it is no fault of the theatre. It is absolutely impossible. Why, the place is kept like a new pin, and all the care in the world spent on everything, and nothing ever forgotten by any of us. There's no theatre in Egypt kept like mine." I told him so, straight to his face. The very idea! But I won't worry myself any more over such a trifle. And, good gracious, it's past 8 o'clock. Why haven't you gone off duty? I do believe you orderlies would never leave off work unless I drove you away from it. And that is a fair sample of the way things go between the masculine and feminine nursing staff of the R.A.M.C. in Egypt, or, for the matter of that, anywhere in the service. It is an old story, of course. You may train a woman's head and hands for any responsible work in the world, but you cannot train her nature. Beneath it all she remains a woman, the thing created out of Adam's rib ages and ages ago, complete, finite, unalterable in essence. And the real thing is sure to crop up through the surface time and again, no matter whether she be queen, scullery maid, review star, or a hospital sister wearing the Royal Red Cross. I often wonder whether Sir Alfred Keogh realised what a Pandora's box of mingled blessings and troubles he was opening within his realm when he created the present system, setting the women over the men in the nursing branch of the R.A.M.C. Be it understood here that I intend to put up no fight against either the act or the fact. I admit that the one was inevitable, and the other its necessary corollary. We orderlies know perfectly well that we were fairly and squarely beaten. It was a fair duel between the sexes, and we lost, as men must always lose in any war of mere wits with women. We were good nursing orderlies. We knew our job, but we had one besetting sin, a craze for militarism. It was this that prevented us organising, and so made our downfall inevitable. While we were playing at soldiering, marching and forming fours, shunning and saluting, getting a dazzle on our boots and buttons, and picking up all manner of other dandy military tricks, just an inchoate, happy, hard-working rabble of nursery kids. The women were training and organising, making themselves fit to command us. That they got what they had so thoroughly prepared themselves for, we have no right to complain of, much less to blame the Director General. It is open to us, however, while loyally and sportingly accepting the situation thus created, to try and save a little from the wreck, to point out certain faults in, and abuses of, the present system, which, as a matter of fact, cry out very loudly indeed for redress. No one who has worked for long in a R.A.M.C. General Hospital can overlook the truth that there exists today a certain amount of unnecessary friction, in some cases downright animosity, between the male and female sections of the nursing staff. It is due, I believe, not so much to the shortcomings of the men, as to a lack of interest and understanding on the part of certain of the women. The drawback to the system of setting the women over the men in a hospital ward is that its proper working depends too much on personality. It either succeeds triumphantly or utterly fails, according to whether the woman in power is great or small-minded. A charge sister who governs her ward with consistent and invariable justice, geniality, and regard to the susceptibilities of her staff, will find roses, roses all the way. The ward work will go like a summer song, but capricious severity, favouritism, wilful illogic of deed or word, want of heart and common charity, will make for trouble all round. These together, or any one of them separately, will cause otherwise really conscientious men to do as little, instead of as much, as they can. They will create lead swinging, toadyism, and general discontent. Men by nature frank and independent minded are likely to develop under this bad influence either an undisguised, insolent opposition, or at least a covert hostility. The very least that will happen is that orderlies thoroughly suited for hospital ward work will be driven to apply for service in the field ambulances, or even to exchange out of the corps altogether. anywhere out of the way of the women, as was said to me once by a really competent nursing orderly whom I had lost sight of in Cairo, and ultimately lit upon on a cookhouse fatigue somewhere out on the desert. Of this man it was said by the surgeon under whom he worked that he was one of the best orderlies he had ever had. And yet the capricious dislike of an otherwise worthy young woman had succeeded in driving him from the work for which, both by training and inclination, he was peculiarly fitted, and had reduced him to peeling potatoes on Sinai Desert. He peeled the potatoes very well indeed, but that only added to the pathos of the situation. He stood for an example of a preventable waste of manpower due to a remediable abuse of woman power. And I respectfully lay the matter before the ladies of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, both in and out of Egypt. Was it right, though the potato peelings may have been as thin as poppy leaves, that this man's higher capabilities should have been lost to his fellows? In effect, by the unreasoning act of one of your sisterhood, you said to an unknown number of wounded soldiers, "You cannot have your wounds dressed, nor your suffering bodies cleansed, but a lot of men will get potatoes in their stew today, 100 miles away." Does the argument appeal to you? I will own that when I put it to Sister Z the other afternoon, she fired up, said I was talking nonsense, and immediately gave me the whole cupboardful of dressing forceps to clean, a good 2 hours' work, even if it wanted doing, which it did not. But a little later she said, "Your friend will soon be avenged anyway. Sister X has got a shift to Messpo, much to her disgust, and will be off next week. But I don't think she'll be missed a great deal, except at salts or groppies perhaps. Now put all that finicky stuff away and be off to your tea." How can a real, workable modus vivendi be established in the hospitals, so that the men and women may each be able to go about their several tasks without friction or strained feeling? The question is about as difficult to answer as that other famous one: how can the state of matrimony be rendered a state of unvarying harmony and goodwill? Neither, of course, ever will be answered with logical completeness. Something, however, can be done, I think, if we approach each question from the avowedly illogical standpoint of ignoring irremovable causes and confining our efforts to the nullification of effects. Once, in a rueful hour, I conceived the notion of writing a book, to be called Practical Suggestions to Ward Sisters on the Management and Mismanagement of Men. I have grown older and wiser since that sore, indignant time. Now nothing would induce me to put pen to paper in so uncouth and visionary an enterprise. But I could talk to the orderlies themselves through 3 fat volumes, I think, that is, if any of them could be induced to read, much less to mark, learn, and inwardly digest. Of a truth, nursing orderlies, the very best of them, are steeped to the eyes in ignorance of women and their ways. That is the bedrock cause of the whole trouble. Not 100th part of all the bickerings, misunderstandings, and little strifes that occur daily in the wards would ever get beyond the stage of a harmless, salutary breeze, if the men could bring a little philosophy to bear on the occasion. It is all really very simple. We have first to admit, and fully reconcile ourselves with, The fact that as nursing orderlies we have been placed in subordination to the sisters of the wards, and in their absence to any feminine authority they may depute in their stead. This is the system in force, and however much we may disagree with it and dislike it, we are bound loyally to accept it until such a time as the system may be mended or ended. Whether it ever will be changed is neither here nor there. For my own part, I am not sure that any change in the direction of weakening feminine jurisdiction in a military hospital would be a change for the better. It is indisputable that the presence of women in the wards acts as a potent check on the behaviour of the patients, many of whom have only too great cause for restlessness and ennui, which, with a certain class of men, notoriously tend towards a slackening of discipline. I doubt if a purely male nursing staff, even if we were all NCOs, used to the maintenance of military order, would be able to keep a proper spirit of discipline alive among the patients. You cannot "strafe" and you cannot mete out the usual forms of punishment to a crowd of bedridden or semi-convalescent men. But the mere presence of ladies in a ward absolves all these difficulties. Everyone is kept permanently on his best behaviour. The average soldier does, and says, all things differently when there are women about. The fact that there is a cool, neat, quiet figure in nun-like robes moving about the place, or even the knowledge that any moment such a humanising apparition may come sailing in at the door, keeps a check on all tongues, and prevents horseplay or buffoonery. Moreover, there is another reason why the retention of the system is desirable, and in my view downright necessary, under the present conditions. The Director General gave the women the giantess's strength, and there is no doubt that a few of them use it as giantesses, which is very wrong indeed. But the great majority employ their power as alone it should be employed, in the due direction of affairs, according to their superior knowledge and attainments. There is no blinking the fact of their superiority to us in the matters of technical knowledge and trained skill. The education which a R.A.M.C. hospital orderly receives under the official curriculum is manifestly inferior to that possessed by a qualified member of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. To deny this is to deny the plain evidence of one's senses. It only goes in support of what I have already said. Militarism has been the real stumbling block of the R.A.M.C. It has absorbed time which ought to have been devoted to additional training in medical and surgical matters. No doubt the soldier's coat and bright buttons served the very useful purpose of an inducement to enlist, and therefore commended itself to an astute War Office. But R.A.M.C. orderlies ought to be above these primeval promptings. Being mere men, however, and young men at that, they were nothing of the kind. They elected to be soldiers, and as such, of course, gave up their civilian right to organise. The women were wiser, and their wisdom bore its inevitable fruit. They saw that organisation was everything. They created a magnificent institution, which turned out a product of a quality opposing excellence to our mediocrity. And in the nature of things, we were bound to go to the wall, where we are equally bound to stop until we prove ourselves worthy of other destinies. The sisters rule the wards simply because they are more competent to do so than the brothers, and any other arrangement, for the present at least, seems to be alike contrary to justice, to public policy, and to common sense. In view of these facts, there remains only one thing for the male nursing staff to do, and that is scrupulously to play the game. It is a harder game to play, perhaps, in Egypt's hot, trying climate than in the soft serenity of Netley, but there is nothing in it that need surpass the wit of man. The main fact to remember is that, though a woman may be a skilled and long experienced hospital sister or matron, with half the letters of the alphabet after her name, by nature and instinct she yet remains a woman and must invariably be treated as such. The least that is due to her at all times are an inexhaustible patience and a courteous, conciliatory manner from each male member of her staff. If all sisters were like Sister Z, nothing more than these would be needed to make things go as smoothly as any human relationship can be expected to fare from day to day. Sister Z has all the inconsequences of her sex, and sometimes she uses her tongue with as little selective intent for harm, and as much dire execution as one who should swing a naked sword about in a crowded room after the gas has gone out. Yet she has a true woman's heart, and is, moreover, the best theatre sister that I ever knew or heard of. But ward sisters in Egypt are unfortunately not all like Sister Z. The climate tries them sorely. In many cases they are systematically overworked. Responsibility, though they unhesitatingly assume it, is not naturally a feminine attribute, and they assume it at heavy cost, paid for in the suppression of many of their finer qualities. Nor is it natural that women should boss men, and I think in their heart of hearts they rather despise us for having come under their yoke, which in itself is not a circumstance likely to promote good feeling from either side. To these ingredients of an admittedly delicate situation must be added one more, the undoubted fact that a few, very few, possess not the smallest instinct of ladyhood, a direful shortcoming indeed for any woman in authority as well as for her unhappy subordinates. Yet, in spite of all these complications, what is our plain policy towards the establishment of the much desired modus vivendi advocated above? The answer is simple enough. It can be put in a nutshell, or rather a series of nutshells. Perhaps, however, the professional metaphor of a tabloid would be more to the purpose. And here are some tabloids which have proved efficacious in the cure of many a little disorder in my own somewhat checkered career as a nursing orderly, and may be of like service to others. I set them down haphazard as they occur to me. First and foremost, the hospital ward orderly's sheet anchor, his grand motto, his triple body shield: patience, endurance, silence. Any sort of silence is silver, courteous silence is gold. Silence, courtesy, sympathy, conciliation, ready amendment of anything, anyhow and anywhere, make together a diadem of precious stones. Keep this piece of regal furniture always at hand, and put it on at the first sign of an electrically overladen atmosphere. Always be in the right, but never say you are so. Let facts speak for themselves. It is a great mistake to suppose that women are by nature illogical. The more unthinking of us get that notion through judging them by first words and first acts, which, in a woman, amount to no more than trying a pen on the blotting paper before settling to write. They are as little to be taken as guides to what will eventually be thought or done than the first froth on a wine vat is gauge of the true quality of liquor that will ultimately be beneath. Intuition really guides a woman, and intuition is instant, although not instantly perceived by her. She must feel about, so to say, before she gets into touch with it, which explains the apparently inconsequent preliminaries. Trust the facts to do all the necessary talking, and at the right moment. Hasty, inopportune words often put the rightest man in the wrongest place. Many an orderly has got confined to barracks merely because he had put the truth in the wrong words at the wrong time. Never try for the last word. The real last word is the true one, and the true word, if it must be said, is better said first than last. If circumstances compel you to speak, say what you have to say once and clearly, and have done with it. Reasseveration only clouds an issue. Know your job as nursing orderly through and through, but do not mind if she elects to teach it you with unnecessary vehemence every time the wind blows off the desert, or the surgeon has found fault with her, or she has had a letter or hasn't had a letter, as the case may be. If the sister has made a mistake in the course of her ward work, try to obliterate its consequences, for your own sake, quietly and unobtrusively, but keep your mouth shut about it to her, and especially to others. If the mistake is serious and likely to attract action from high quarters, you may be compelled to say and do what is necessary to prevent yourself being drawn into the maelstrom of trouble. But content yourself with the bare minimum in this direction. Above all, do not seek to make capital out of it for your own advantage. The orderly who tries to "score" off the sister is about as sensible as a man who plays football with a beehive. He is deliberately foregoing his chance of future peace and quiet for the sake of a little doubtful present entertainment. Let Nemesis attend to her own job. Don't join in the ablution room parliaments. The chance gatherings of orderlies in course of the day's round for cigarettes and mutual confidences, which are a common feature of military hospital life all the Empire over. There are times when an occasional draw becomes well nigh a necessity to most of us. Half a pipeful of tobacco has many a time restored a tired man's nerve and sent him back to the ward ready and bright for another long spell of duty. But these precious stolen moments in the day are best enjoyed in solitude. For some unfathomable reason, women always regard gossiping as a heinous offence in men. Lastly, it comes last in these random jottings, but in importance it should come earlier. Resist every tendency, or shadow of a tendency, to a familiar relationship with any member of the female nursing staff. All sisters are regarded officially as holding the equivalent of commissioned rank. It is our policy, as well as our duty, to insist that this fact should never be lost sight of, either by them or ourselves, and it is by far the wiser plan for an orderly to include all nurses of whatever grade or qualification in the same inviolable category. There are many women in the Army nursing service whose normal attitude towards the men they work with is one of exquisitely delicate forethought and Christian charity. Women who never forget that orderlies are human beings of a like creation with themselves, and who love to leaven the dreary lump of the day's common task with a word or little act of common human kindness. With these it is a hard matter to appear irresponsive, to let a kind word fall stillborn in the humdrum waste of daily affairs. Nor is it at all necessary thus to drive a principle to the death. There are 100 little ways in which appreciation can be shown outside the grosser form of spoken phrases. But there are, equally, many women in the service from which it is alike perilous to accept favours in word or deed. You are never on sure ground with them. One day you are overwhelmed with an effusive urbanity, or find yourself the recipient of private confidences that fairly take away your breath. The next day the barometer has fallen headlong. There is nothing but a lowering sky for you, the chill patter of rain, and a steely lightning glitter of glances. Even your modest claim to be regarded as human pabulum may seem to be contemptuously rejected. The very doormat of the annex, in the lowly favours extended to it, seems better off than you. Such a game of social seesaw is intolerable for any self-respecting man. The only thing to do is to meet all, advances and repulses alike, with the same quiet, unvarying civility, being neither exalted nor cast down, and preserving the even, busy tenor of your way regardless as to whether the road be rough or smooth, the atmosphere balmy or tempestuous. If manhood stands for any certain definite qualities in a woman's eyes, it stands for consistency, equanimity, magnanimity. Women trust us and depend on us much more than they will admit to us or to themselves, much more, indeed, than they ever know. End of section 18. Section 19 of With the Royal Army Medical Corps in Egypt by Sergeant Major R.A.M.C. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. The Egyptian Labour Corps. The medical side of its organisation under the R.A.M.C. In the pages of this chronicle, much ground which is familiar to the general student of the war has necessarily been traversed. It is doubtful, however, if the particular branch of R.A.M.C. activity in the Near East, now to be dealt with, will fall within the knowledge of many. It is even possible that the vast majority of British readers will never have heard of it at all. And yet the story of what the Royal Army Medical Corps has done for the great army of native Egyptian workmen employed concurrently with the British forces in this part of the world is a record of what may well be called a remarkable, even a redoubtable, achievement. The device of making use of Egypt's great natural resources in unskilled yet far from unintelligent labour towards the prosecution of the war in its various zones, had its instigation very early in the times of the Dardanelles campaign. Our overseas base at Mudrose, in Byron's romantic isle of the Aegean, splendidly fit and practicable, a fulcrum for a great military lever to work from, as it eventually became, consisted at first of nothing but the rawest of raw material from which to fashion a great military depot and offensive port. Quays, docks, landing stages had to be constructed, 1,001 various buildings erected, roads suitable for the passage of large bodies of troops and heavy impedimenta of war had to be made between the various camps. A water supply by condensation on a large scale had to be devised, no source of fresh water worthy of the name existing on the island. For all these enterprises, labour on a very extensive scale was needed. The necessary skilled labour and supervisory personnel was obtained through the usual channels, but for the prosecution of the large amount of navvy work involved, we were up against a difficulty. No local supply of labour was available. We conceived, therefore, the project of importing large numbers of workmen from our Egyptian base overseas. Theoretically, the idea was a capital one, and, so long as the men retained their health, it worked exceedingly well. Eventually we had in Mudros a large number of Egyptians, these being principally employed in road making, a class of work for which there was great need, roads of any military value being practically non-existent on the Isle of Lemnos. But, unfortunately, the wild, bitter climate of these Aegean Isles proved too much for the sun-nurtured Egyptians, and a large amount of sickness prevailed in their ranks. We of the R.A.M.C. did our best for them, despite innumerable difficulties. But in the absence of a properly organised medical system, exclusively devoted to these dusky hordes from the south, their sick and death rates mounted inconveniently high. It was an experience dearly bought, yet one by which we did not fail to profit in the time that followed. When, after the excavation of the peninsula, the great offensive-defensive scheme for the protection of the Suez Canal came into force, and again vast numbers of Egyptian labourers were needed, the whole problem of securing their well-being while in our employment was thoroughly taken in hand. Hitherto, the vast proportion of preliminary work within the Canal Zone had been carried through by Egyptian contractors, who supplied their own native labour. But now the authorities decided to adopt the principle of employing the Egyptian workmen at first hand. The whole scheme was organised on military lines. The Egyptian Labour Corps and the Camel Transport Corps were created and placed under British commanders, with staffs of British officers. Recruiting stations were opened at convenient centres throughout the Nile area. Fair terms, with clothing and rations, for a minimum of 3 months' service, were offered and readily accepted. The organisation expanded rapidly, until eventually we had a force of many thousand Egyptian labourers continuously employed on military works and service in connection with the canal defences and the expedition across the Sinai Desert. The Egyptian lower-class workman, in fact, has proved himself an invaluable asset to the Empire in all sorts of ways. The Egyptian Labour Corps has supplied all the unskilled labour necessary for the construction of roads, railways, defence works, etc., throughout the whole Suez Canal defensive scheme. It has also provided the men who built the railway across the Sinai Desert to Gaza, who laid the wonderful water main over the same route, and who constructed all the roads, reservoirs and other innumerable works with which this 230-mile stretch of desert is marked from end to end. It supplied, in addition, men for various duties, such as sanitary routine, scavenging and the like, in all camps and permanent stations under the Egyptian command, east or west. The Camel Transport Corps has rendered equally important service. Throughout our advance over the desert, where heavy-wheeled vehicles were impossible, the Camel Transport Corps has undertaken the conveyance of all baggage, stores, water, ammunition, everything, in fact, that our troops, operating month after month while in advance of the railway, needed for the furtherance of their difficult task. The medical supervision of this big army of natives would have been no light task, even if the men had been concentrated in a single district. As it was, however, the exigencies of their service caused them to be scattered in large and small parties over hundreds of miles of desert, and they were, moreover, continually shifting their positions as the various works progressed or the troops advanced. Any medical surveillance of them, therefore, to be effective, had to be undertaken on complete and well thought out lines, and the present organisation was instituted. A separate department of the R.A.M.C. was created and placed under the charge of an experienced medical officer. Under this new organisation, a network of Egyptian hospitals, detention camps, etc., gradually came into being, eventually extending right across the Sinai Desert and throughout the whole canal zone, from Port Said in the north to Suez at the southern extremity of the canal. The Western Desert was also included in the same organisation, hospitals being established at Mersa Matruh and Sollum. This service, at the date of writing, absorbs the whole attention of 20 medical officers and 65 R.A.M.C. orderlies, these being assisted by 60 native doctors and some 400 native orderlies, or termages. Taking one typical period of 6 months, November 1916 to April 1917, we find that about 24,000 patients were treated in these hospitals, all being men from the Egyptian Labour Corps or the Camel Transport Corps. The conditions of service for the staff in charge of these native hospitals were peculiarly trying and difficult. Though several of the hospitals, notably those at Ismailia and Kantara, were permanent or semi-permanent in character, most of them had to shift their ground in accordance with the movements of the bodies of labourers whose interests they were serving. As the railway was pushed forward over the desert, or our army advanced, the native population moved with them, and hospital accommodation had to be readjusted accordingly, this chain of hospitals being so maintained that wherever gangs of labourers or transport men were congregated, or wherever dumps employing native labour existed, medical aid was always within easy reach. Apart from this peripatetic character of the hospitals, which necessitated much heavy work on occasion and materially increased the problem of maintaining medical supplies, the actual conduct of the hospital work was fraught with difficulty. The average lower class Egyptian is a prey to various obstinate and often obscure diseases, of which, however, by far the most important in regard to frequency is that known as relapsing fever. This fever was so common among our Egyptian Labour Corps and Camel Transport Corps native labourers that usually as many as 80% of the patients in a hospital would be suffering from it. It was the great cause of the depletion of manpower in the two Egyptian corps, and from the very earliest days in the campaign, all medical effort and ingenuity were focused on the problem of its prevention. At first its cause and vehicle of dissemination baffled all attempts at discovery. But at length our bacteriologists succeeded in clearing up the mystery. The specific organism of relapsing fever was definitely isolated, and the guilt of its propagation finally brought home to an old offender, the ubiquitous body louse. Thereafter, the treatment of this complaint, both curative and preventive, became straightforward, if not easy. While as yet no actual cure for the fever has been discovered, certain materia medica have been employed against it with promising results. And as regards the body pests, the inveterate war which was at once instituted against them among the native workmen resulted in an enormous reduction in the number of cases of the disease occurring. This latter question, however, belongs properly to another branch of the R.A.M.C. Egyptian Hospitals Organisation, and will be dealt with in a subsequent paragraph. In addition to the large number of relapsing fever cases treated in this widely comprehensive system of native hospitals, there were a great many cases of eye trouble, skin diseases, and of injuries due to accidents and to camel bites. The camel has been of the utmost service to us in this desert war. Indeed, it is difficult to see how we would ever have got our army through the Sinai wilderness without his aid. We owe him a heavy debt, but we have this to lay to his charge as a usurer. He has proved himself a very Shylock among quadrupeds, never failing literally to take his pound of flesh whenever the chance presented itself. These cases of camel bites are constantly occurring among the native drivers. They are always serious, the cruel jaws crushing through everything, flesh and bone, resistlessly, and the wounds thus caused are nearly always septic, the camel being a particularly unclean beast about the mouth. This, and the many accidents which befell members of the working gangs, necessitated frequent operations in the Egyptian hospitals, and required the provision for each of a full surgical equipment and staff. There is perhaps no more interesting or informative experience for the student in the art of empire making than that afforded by a visit to one of these field units under the sway of the Egyptian Hospitals branch of the R.A.M.C. In them you see the best of Britain's traditions appertaining to the government of Oriental races, in full, smooth, triumphantly successful working order. And you see them on a scale sufficiently large, and under conditions sufficiently varied, to enable a fairly accurate estimate to be formed as to our chances of making good in the Empire sense with this, which, for all our lengthy occupation of Egypt, must be regarded as the newest and latest of Eastern peoples to come under our sway. For, so long as the old paralysing clog of Turkish suzerainty remained upon Egypt, we were too busy a nation to devote overmuch thought to a country whose future, as part of the British Empire, seemed indefinitely obscured. Now, however, that all this ambiguity of relationship between Egypt and the Empire has been finally cleared away, we, that is at least the men of the British Army in Egypt, who may fairly be regarded as typical of their nation, are looking at the country and the people with new eyes and wholly new interest, as well as appreciation of all that recent changes may portend for Britain and Egyptian alike. When we speak of the Egyptian people, it would be as well to make it quite clear that we mean the great bulk of the middle and lower class native-born Muslim population, the men who do all the work on the land, and who vastly outnumber every other class. And of these men, albeit of the humbler sort, you obtain a pretty clear perception in regard to their qualities as human material by a quiet survey of any of our native hospital camps. Practically these camps are all under canvas, not only on account of the need for mobility, but because the big canvas marquee has proved itself most suitable for almost every hospital purpose on the desert. Taking the same period of 6 months as before, November 1916 to April 1917, we find that there were 17 of these native hospitals under the R.A.M.C. in various parts of the war area, including the Egyptian base, and that in these hospitals an aggregate of some 2,000 beds was provided. Except at the non-mobile establishment at Ismailia, where iron bedsteads are in use, these beds consist simply of a waterproof ground sheet and blankets laid upon a given space of sand within the marquee, this form of accommodation being found sufficient for all native requirements. At Kantara, where the whole system can be very conveniently studied, there is, at the time of writing, tentage sufficient for 1,200 beds, but this provision can, and frequently is, extended to over 1,500. The Kantara Egyptian Hospital is situated on a well-raised plateau of firm sand immediately eastward of the Suez Canal, and far enough from the bustling war base to be as quiet as need be for sick and suffering people. The first impression you get on arriving within its precincts is one of a seaside camp, large and populous, but eminently quiet and orderly. To all intents and purposes, the Suez Canal, with its clean, abruptly sloping sandy shores and broad stretch of glittering blue water, is the sea, and when the wind blows across it, the air is as pleasantly salt-laden as on any breezy day at Margate. The hospital is conducted as nearly as possible on British R.A.M.C. lines, especially in regard to sanitary matters, but it is neither practicable nor necessary to enforce white man routine in its entirety on these bronze-visaged Orientals. The Kantara Hospital was started in April 1916 with 150 beds, since which date it has steadily expanded to the dimensions already stated, to keep pace with the increase in the number of natives employed in the district. It now serves as the base hospital for over 50,000 Egyptians. The average daily admissions are about 100. Beside the Egyptian labourers, over 700 wounded Turks have also been treated in it from time to time. The British personnel consists of 10 medical officers and 8 R.A.M.C. men, the ward orderlies being natives, mainly recruited from reservists of the Egyptian Army Medical Corps. the material for the following slight sketch of a day's routine and the work generally of this admirably conducted hospital is derived from an account given personally to the writer on a recent visit by the commanding officer himself, and it will be of interest not only because it indicates the difference between the systems of management of our R.A.M.C. British and native hospitals, but because it incidentally throws various quaint sidelights on lower class Egyptian character and temperament. In this hospital, it may be remarked, the small separate tent is eschewed as far as possible, the wards consisting of a number of large, lofty marquees placed end to end, their canvas sides being removed, except in the rare seasons of inclement weather. The wards, therefore, are more in the nature of long, spacious sun shelters, open on all sides, an arrangement admitting abundance of light and air vastly to the health and comfort of the patients. Soon after 5 a.m. of each morning, the hospital presents a busy scene, as it is being cleaned for the day. The whole site consists of sand, and the patients are expert in giving this an attractive appearance. The territory of each ward is marked out by a small surrounding sandbank, the entrances being indicated in the same way. The surfaces of this bank are carefully smoothed and sometimes ornamented. The gangway down the middle of the ward is treated in the same fashion, the patients then lying in a long row on either side. The whole interior surface of the ward is smoothed over, each patient attending to his own small area. He will thus sit, or rather squat, for hours, contentedly patting and stroking it with his lean brown hands. This daily grooming of the sand results in a fresh surface being continually exposed, but at intervals the whole superficies is removed and new clean sand brought in from outside. In the wards the patients lie on the ground, each with his blankets and mackintosh sheet, only the more helpless cases having beds in the special wards. Before going to sleep, the men encase themselves entirely in their blankets, head and foot, a method which effectively wards off winged pests. The helpless patients have their food brought to their bedside, but the others gather for meals in the open air in an enclosure, marked off by the inevitable sandbank, hard by each ward. All are given milk at 6 o'clock each morning. Breakfast is at 8 a.m. and consists of rice milk only for the milk diets, but for the rest of lentils, dates and bread. At midday, tea and milk or rice milk only are given. Dinner is served at 4 p.m. and is made up of rice milk, or meat, onions, or other vegetables, rice and bread. The final meal is taken at 8 p.m. and consists of milk only. The meat at dinner is an unheard of luxury for most of this class of native. The more affluent of them would only get it once or twice a week at home. In the hospital the official meat ration is a very small one, no more than 2 ounces daily. But all the men have a pound of bread for their day's supply, which is more than twice that given to the British soldier. When eating, the Egyptian uses his fingers alone for every purpose. The food is served out in fairly large bowls, and a group of men squat round each bowl, making common cause with its contents. There is, however, never any difficulty with them as to sharing. The procedure as regards the medical officer's daily round does not differ from that common to other hospitals. All cases needing surgical treatment are sent to the wooden hut which serves as operating theatre and dressing station, only bedridden cases being attended to in the wards. It is wonderful with what fortitude, fatalistic composure, and childlike faith in the skill of the Effendi Inglesi the native Egyptian submits himself to the most painful wound dressing processes, and to what are no doubt the inexplicable methods of British medical science. In this regard the Egyptian compares very favourably with his European confrère. Usually very little discussion and explanation are required to obtain from him a ready consent to an operation. The injuries that befall him in his service to the Empire are often of a very trying character, as beyond the ordinary accidents of the working day, he is, as before mentioned, especially liable to camel bites, which are frequently severe and always badly infected. They are therefore very slow in healing, and involve many painful dressings, while the worst bites may lead to loss of a limb or even the death of the patient. With natives in hospital, almost the entire day is spent in talking. Interminable animated discussions go on between them as they sit in conclave, the principal topics dealt with being their small money matters and the latest exploits of the dreaded Turk. When they are not wrangling together in their inimitable gentle bantering way, they are telling each other long tales of enchantment after the style of the Arabian Nights, or lie crowded together in every spot of shadow fast asleep. At 3 o'clock of each afternoon, those who are fit for it go down to bathe in the canal. Often 200 or 300 of them may be seen at a time splashing lustily about like a delighted covey of coots, or squatting up to their necks in the shining azure water. At this time also they wash their thin summer suits, both clothes and men under the fierce desert sun being sufficiently dry for reunion by the time they can be prevailed upon to return to the hospital. Towels, be it understood, are an unknown commodity in the lower class Egyptian world. The great event of the day, however, takes place at 5 o'clock on each evening. This is the discharge parade. The commanding officer sits in state within the big EPIP tent, which serves him for office, and receives, one after the other, all those who are eligible for discharge from the hospital, or seek to be liberated for various reasons. Practically all are eager for their discharge, hospital life under British control being rather an ordeal for the native. Probably his sole experience of the healing art hitherto has been confined to an occasional visit to the village barber, who, in rural Egypt, still for the most part, fills the office of medical man to the community quite in the medieval way. The native hospital patient, however, is not always in a hurry to exchange his snug quarters and easy life for the rough and tumble of the desert again. Now and then a man will be found, apparently willing and anxious to spend the rest of his life in the hospital, and he will resort to every expedient and exhaust all his powers of persuasion with the medical officer to that end. In this case, he becomes an adept at making the most and the longest of his affliction, and will feign all sorts of ills to get his term of incarceration prolonged. Not the least difficult of the officer commanding's duties at this discharge parade is to discriminate between real and fictitious disabilities. In this matter, a thorough knowledge of the quaint variety of Arabic spoken in rural Egypt is almost a sine qua non with the officer. In fact, all R.A.M.C. medical officers doing duty in native hospitals and most of the British orderlies are adept at this. It would be well, indeed, if the possession of a fair knowledge of the Egyptian Arabic were officially regarded as a necessary part of the professional equipment of all R.A.M.C. men stationed in Egypt. The language is not an easy one to read or write, but it can readily be picked up by ear, and a certain facility in this direction should be required of all our men coming into contact with the natives. The sequel to this discharge parade is usually a picturesque one. Those fortunate enough to obtain their discharge, especially those whose time of service has expired, and therefore are now to return to their homes, immediately go into paroxysms of joy at their deliverance. Hastily gathering their belongings together, they make for the railway station in a delighted, vociferous crew, clapping their hands rhythmically, chanting weird folk songs, and waving improvised flags. Generally, in their excitement, they run all the way to the station. They crowd into the open trucks that are to bear them away westward to the land of their fathers, and long after the train has disappeared round the curve of the line, the sound of their rejoicing lingers on the evening breeze. You turn your back to the hospital, feeling glad, somehow, that the world is not all progress and culture, and that there are still some odd corners left in it, where man, as nature made him, can yet find a little elbow room. The R.A.M.C. medical officer in command of the Kantara establishment possesses all the dominant racial traits which have made British rule over Eastern peoples such a success wherever our flag flies. But in addition to these, his government of the hospital evidences another quality, much rarer, though also essentially British, that of being able to tell one black man from another, to realise the fundamental divergences of character and temperament between the various coloured races, and to adopt his methods accordingly. The writer has no experience of the Oriental peoples under our sway, east of Suez, where the best is like the worst, but from a fairly extended acquaintance with the lower class Egyptian, the typical Egyptian Labour Corps or Camel Transport Corps man, he is convinced that upon a true estimation of his peculiar racial qualities depends all our success in governing him both in the present time of war and hereafter. The average nabob from the Far East seems to regard his authority over the native Orientals with whom he comes into contact as dependent on the preservation of a demeanour compacted of frigid aloofness, suspicion, and contempt, the whole being reinforced by a carefully nurtured reputation for a ready resort to harshness or downright brutality on occasion. But nothing of all this will do in Egypt, and the sooner we realise it the better. The pure-blooded Egyptian is at heart a child, and a child of, in many ways, very attractive and lovable qualities into the bargain. Childlike, what we choose to make of him now, he will become, and after the like kind he will bring up those other children he is begetting in such large numbers. After the nature of the child all the world over, he possesses within him the seeds of every good and every evil quality, and the responsibility lies upon us now to see that he develops on the right lines. The most disastrous mistake we could well make would be to attempt to rule him mainly by the rod, not because he does not sometimes deserve, and indeed often gets, a sharp cut from the cane of his British overseer, but because he is by nature essentially unwarlike, and therefore, in the main, incapable of profiting in the right way by physical punishment. This, indeed, must be the keynote of all our dealings with the Egyptian, if he is ever to grow out of childhood into real manhood under our hegemony. As in the training of all children, the fact must be first established that we are not to be trifled with, nor deceived by dissembling or other elemental guile. But once this wholesome spirit has been instilled into him, our further policy is clear. It must be frankly directed towards the development of his undoubted qualities of industry, sociability, a good and often keen understanding, and a trainable capacity for all those little arts of life which, for the want of a better word in his case, we must call civilised. In these vaunting days, when we are all, high and low, taking our turn at blowing the national trumpet, the writer need make no excuse for attempting here a little fanfaronade on his own account. The greatest good thing that ever happened to the middle and lower class Egyptian, or indeed for that matter to every man in the country, Muslim or Christian, willing to get an honest living by the work of his own head or hands, is the fact that Egypt has now unconditionally thrown in her lot with the British Empire. The goodness and greatness of this thing may not be so apparent to those in the country falling within the category named upper class. Hereditary idleness, as part of an obsolescent national system, never does expire amiably, nor even picturesquely. The mistletoe is able to live very comfortably at the expense of the apple tree, and it can hardly be expected to display much enthusiasm during the first acute stages when it is being compelled to subsist by its own roots. But the sentiments of Egypt's mistletoe class of humanity need not concern us here. It is the tree itself, the great mass of gentle-hearted, courteous, ease-loving, yet truly industrious folk that make up the bulk of the nation, towards whom we must direct all our hopes and efforts. It is not for nothing that Egyptians have been a subject race, have lived under the yoke of one conqueror after another, for thousands of years back. What they have lost in one way, they have immeasurably gained in another. They lack initiative, and dread responsibility as a cat dreads water, but they have a chameleon-like power of ready adaptation to imposed ideas that is almost Japanese in quality. We have it in our power, therefore, now to make or mar them, and if the writer were asked to put into one short phrase the vital policy which should govern all our future efforts to bring Egypt into line with the rest of the Empire, this would be the answer. Treat the Egyptians as if they were a nation of Boy Scout recruits. Start them right at the beginning of every elementary principle of honour, discipline, good form, healthy hardihood of body and mind, and all the wholesome, reasonable give and take comprised in the word neighbourliness. It will not be done in a month or a year, nor perhaps in many years, but it can be done. The raw material for the work is no sow's ear, but good silk all through, and the silk purse is sure to materialise in time. The Egyptian hospital system for the treatment of the sick and injured of the two native service corps covers, as we have already seen, all the canal zone between Port Said and Suez, as well as the entire desert line of march between the Kantara base on the canal and our furthermost trenches under Gaza in Palestine. It also extends along the northern boundary of the desert to the west of Egypt. With this system there exists concurrently a series of isolation hospitals for the treatment of any cases of cholera that may occur among the native population. Such cholera camps have been established at Deir el-Bala and Sheikh Nuran on our extreme eastern defences, and at Rafah, El Arish and Kantara on the desert line of communication. There is, in addition, a special cholera hospital containing 60 beds at Deir el-Bala, used exclusively for prisoners of war. The great bulk of sick and wounded prisoners is dealt with at the main R.A.M.C. prisoners of war hospitals in Cairo, Alexandria and elsewhere, these establishments being staffed by British orderlies and nursing sisters of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, and in themselves form no inconsiderable portion of the general work of the R.A.M.C. in Egypt. But we have well appointed camp hospitals of 200 beds, each wholly confined to the treatment of wounded prisoners and those suffering from diseases other than cholera, at both Deir el-Bala on our extreme front and at Kantara. There is also a prisoners of war hospital of 60 beds in connection with the Egyptian hospitals branch of the R.A.M.C. at Port Tewfik near Suez. Altogether, the enemy can have no reason to complain of any neglect on our part in respect of those who have fallen into our hands and are in need of medical aid. Apart, however, from the immense amount of hospital work which has fallen to the lot of the R.A.M.C. in Egypt through casualties and sickness occurring among the men of the Egyptian Labour Corps and the Camel Transport Corps, we have had much else to do in connection with these native services during the whole of the campaign. On the formation of these services, recruiting stations were opened in all the important centres of industry in Egypt, and at each of these R.A.M.C. medical officers were continually in attendance to ensure that none but thoroughly fit men were accepted for the work. During the same typical period of 6 months hitherto dealt with, some 130,000 natives presented themselves to our doctors for examination at these recruiting stations, and of this number 30,000 had to be rejected for various causes, mainly eye trouble, to which the native Egyptian is peculiarly liable. Once accepted for service, the new recruit is put through a regular curriculum before he becomes a full-blown Egyptian Labour Corps or Camel Transport Corps man. Taking the methods adopted by the R.A.M.C. 95th Sanitary Section attached to the Hadra Egyptian Labour Corps camp, as typical of those in vogue at other centres, we see a batch of recruits, on arrival, at once proceed to what is known as the recruits' compound. This is a walled-in enclosure, fitted with latrines, ablution benches, shower baths, cooking places and living tents, and is reserved entirely for new recruits. Here the men are detained until their turn comes for subjection to the very necessary processes of being washed and disinfected. Pending this, each man has his head close clipped and his axilli and pubes shaved, and then, usually within 12 hours of his arrival, he is ready to proceed with his squad to the disinfection station close by, carrying with him his blankets and all personal effects. On arrival at the steam disinfector, he removes his clothing, wraps it, together with his other belongings, in one of the blankets, and leaves the bundle to be dealt with by the disinfecting staff. His other blanket serves him as a robe on his passage to the bathhouse. The bath enclosure being gained, these remaining blankets are collected from the men and at once put into another disinfector, which exists on the spot for the purpose. The recruits are then introduced, 2 at a time, into a large bath of fluid, consisting of a solution of cresol, soft soap, paraffin and sulphur, a combination which can be relied upon to put an end to any insect plague in or out of Egypt. In this bath each man gives himself and his companion a thorough scrubbing, after which he has a plunge into clean water, and then proceeds to the equipment store a few yards away, where he is served out with a new Egyptian Labour Corps uniform, consisting of brown linen slacks and tunic, and also a greatcoat. There remains now nothing for him to do but to recover his civilian belongings from the main disinfector, and march back to the store, where the rest of his equipment, boots, puttees, cap, etc., is completed. The whole process thus described occupies an average time of 3/4 of an hour, in which period the new recruit is changed into a fully equipped member of the Egyptian Labour Corps, and is ready for service in any part of the war area, be it Palestine, Salonika or France. But this preliminary lustration, by which he is started clean, sound and fresh clothed on his new job, and his subsequent care in hospital if sick, by no means exhausts the list of services rendered to the Egyptian Labour Corps or Camel Transport Corps man by the Army Medical Service of Egypt. Having once got him and his belongings clean and free from vermin, our whole art is directed to the task of keeping him so. No easy task, as all will agree, on coming to consider the conditions. In the case of a great force of native labourers distributed in large or small gangs over a wide and difficult country, and these gangs continually shifting from place to place, the most carefully devised system of sanitary control is liable to aberration. In this matter, however, the R.A.M.C. sanitary sections have succeeded admirably, even perhaps a little beyond any reasonable expectation. The ideal was conceived of giving every native labourer in the service a thorough antiseptic cleansing, and his kit a thorough sterilisation at least once a fortnight, and this ideal has been fairly well realised. In addition to the disinfecting installations at all Egyptian hospitals and recruiting depots, we established disinfecting stations at 3 of the most important centres in the military system. These were able to deal with the men within a large radius of their several positions. But to reach those gangs of labourers scattered about on or near the various ramifications of the Desert Railroad, we had to work on a different plan. We equipped 3 disinfection trains, having sterilising vans supplied with steam from the engine, and carrying with them all appliances necessary for the establishment of temporary disinfection stations in sidings of the line within which the train might pull up. Whenever and wherever the train made a pitch, all native camps in the surrounding area were duly notified, and the men willingly flocked in with their belongings to undergo what could not fail to be a very welcome process to all. Throughout the period of hostilities, from the time these systems came into vogue, our R.A.M.C. sanitary men have dealt with an average of 80,000 native labourers monthly, which is a record of useful, if rather unromantic service, of which we may be reasonably proud. Seeing that the great scourge of these lower class Egyptians, and principal cause of inefficiency among them, relapsing fever, originates in infection conveyed by the body louse, it is small wonder that, since our sanitary campaign against personal uncleanliness among the natives came into full force, the incidence of this disease has decreased by 50 or 60%. Before leaving this well nigh inexhaustible subject of our work for the native Egyptians in our Army's employ, we must briefly mention what has been done in the matter of quarantine arrangements as between Egypt and the Eastern theatre of war. The system of enlisting these labourers for so short a term of service as 3 months, though it proved a popular measure and thus materially swelled the stream of recruits, had nevertheless one serious drawback. It created a condition wherein there was a constant dribble of time-expired men back from the war area into all parts of rural Egypt. Cholera being always more or less present with the Turkish forces, and the danger of infection through prisoners, deserters, etc., being therefore considerable, we had to take special measures to safeguard Egypt against this scourge through infection by our returning Egyptian Labour Corps and Camel Transport Corps men. The difficulty was met through the agency of the Egyptian Hospitals branch of the R.A.M.C. by establishing 2 great segregation camps, the one at El Arish and the other at Kantara, where all time-expired labourers could be detained for such period as would ensure their freedom from contamination. In these camps also, thorough disinfection of the person and belongings of all men was carried out, so that the men returned to their homes free from parasites as well as from germs of disease. Not the least important outcome of the work of the R.A.M.C. in Egypt lies perhaps just in this small fact. Every native who enters our service and then goes back to his fellows does so as a living illustration of the advantages of personal cleanliness, and with such a receptive, imitative people as the Egyptians, his example cannot but have far-reaching results. The Oriental who has acquired the daily habit of washing himself has already taken a great step along the road to empire, or to British ideas of empire at least. End of section 19. Section 20 of With the Royal Army Medical Corps in Egypt by Sergeant Major R.A.M.C. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18 In Arduis, Fidelis. In the pages foregoing, an attempt has been made to set before the people of the British Empire some account, albeit an imperfect one, of what the Royal Army Medical Corps has done and is still doing in Egypt. We of the R.A.M.C. in this part of the war zone are under no delusions as to the relative importance in the world struggle of our work, compared with that of the members of the Corps serving on the great Western Front. The distance at which we have laboured may have lent some enchantment to our view of our own doings, but it has not destroyed our sense of proportion. Even so, however, we may fairly claim that our record, as above imperfectly set forth, shows that we have done much, and done it not unworthily, nor without honour. In Arduis Fidelis, the Royal Regiment which elects to bear upon its escutcheon a motto of that exalting kind, needs to take itself and its work seriously. That it has ever done so is within our knowledge and prideful conviction as a corps, and need not be dwelt upon here. And that, in this part of the Near Eastern theatre of war, the R.A.M.C. has still more firmly established its right to the motto, no one who has followed the history of the campaign can reasonably deny. Popular error dies hard, and the idea that the non-combatant section of an army on active service runs none of the risks of war may yet linger in a few adumbrated minds at home. For the information of these folk, it may be well to set down here the following facts as regards casualties and military honours awarded to the men of the R.A.M.C. and the valorous women who served with the Dardanelles Army and with the Egyptian Expeditionary Force up to the end of the year 1916. That is to say, a period of 21 months out of the 3 years of the war. 82 of our ambulance men were killed in action during this period, these being medical officers and men engaged in succouring the wounded during battle. In addition to these, 75 R.A.M.C. men actually died of wounds received in course of their duty, while 610 were more or less severely wounded. Disease accounted for 134 deaths among us. 17 are numbered among the missing, or known to have been taken prisoners by the Turks. 150 were drowned at sea in the various hospital ships sunk within the period taken. Altogether, our casualties amounted to 1,068. This figure is not put forward as anything calling for praise, or even worthy of special remark. It is merely set down here in refutation, if indeed refutation were needed, of the ancient idea that non-combatant regiments are immune from the risks of war. When, however, we come to the question of military honours awarded during the same period to men of the R.A.M.C. in Egypt for conspicuous bravery in the field, or signal devotion to duty, we have every right to be proud of our record, and to expect the nation at large to share our feeling. Members of our corps have been mentioned in dispatches no fewer than 223 times. Men of the rank and file have been awarded 18 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 6 Military Medals, and 3 Meritorious Service Medals, while various foreign decorations have been gained, such as the Médaille Militaire 2, Serbian Gold Medal 3, Serbian Silver Medal 5, Italian Bronze Medal 1, Serbian Silver Star 2nd Class 2, Russian Medal of St George 4th Class 1, and Serbian Cross of Cary George with swords 1. But the R.A.M.C. in Egypt is particularly proud of the honours gained by its officers of all grades. One has received the K.C.B., or Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath. 8 the C.M.G., or Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, and 3. The C.B., or Companion of the Order of the Bath. No fewer than 24 of our medical officers have been decorated with the Military Cross, and 11 with the Distinguished Service Order. 3 have received the Honourable Order of the Bath, 3rd Class, Military Division, and 4 have gained the Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George, 3rd Class. To these British decorations must be added the following awards to our officers from foreign countries. Order of the Nile, 4. Serbian Order of St. Sava, 6. Croix de Guerre, 2. And Serbian Order of the White Eagle, 6. The women of the British Army Medical Service in Egypt have equal right to be proud of the distinctions conferred on them, as they have equally shared in the dangers and privations of the war. 22 have laid down their lives in the service, of which number 11 were victims of the relentlessly cruel and stupid U-boat campaign. But, for the brighter side of the shield, we have to record that 40 members of the Queen Alexandria Imperial Nursing Service and allied institutions have been mentioned in dispatches. 41 have been awarded the much coveted Royal Red Cross, 1st Class, and 75 have gained the 2nd Class decoration of the same order. All these lists of casualties and honours among men and women of the Army Medical Service are carried, it must be remembered, only up to the end of 1916, when our account of the doings of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force naturally terminates. In the saying of a last word there lurks ever a certain amount of pathos, and the writer neither seeks, nor has reason for seeking, to dissemble his regret at the conclusion of a task which, while calling for no little labour, has proved throughout both a pleasant and informing one. To an already pretty close acquaintance with both the personnel and the methods of the Army Medical Service in Egypt and Gallipoli, the work entailed in the preparation of this record, by affording a truer perception of the magnitude of what has been done, has inevitably created a nearer, deeper comradeship with, and admiration for, the men and women who have done it so faithfully in the teeth of so much real difficulty. It is therefore with no feigned emotion that the writer, whose fortune of war it has been to share those difficulties in both spheres of action, will dip his pen to inscribe the word Finis at the end of this page. Before closing, however, brief reference should be made to one matter not hitherto touched upon. This is the assistance rendered to the official medical service in Egypt by the voluntary aid organisations, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem and the British Red Cross Society. Though this is professedly an account of what has been done by the Royal Army Medical Corps alone, and as such necessarily excludes any but incidental reference to the work of the two societies mentioned, it is felt that to close this volume without a full and free acknowledgment of the invaluable aid rendered by these two societies to the regular Army Medical Service would be alike ungenerous and unpatriotic. There is perhaps no member of the R.A.M.C, from the highest to the lowest, who does not clearly recognise the full measure of good work which these societies have done in Egypt. It is due, however, to the officers and men of the official organisation, and such a statement can in no way detract from the praise due to the voluntary societies, to record here exactly what proportion the work of the societies bears to the whole volume of achievement which is to be placed to the credit of the British Medical Service in Egypt. This may be accurately set down as about 3%. The estimate is not official. The figure, indeed, is quoted from a speech delivered by Sir Courtauld Thompson, the Chief Commissioner of the Red Cross Combined Organisations in Egypt, and may therefore be taken as unimpeachable. At first sight, such a figure applied to the work of these societies may appear disappointingly, astonishingly small. It is not, however, really so. A percentage is only a relative term. We are not dealing in this case with 3% of a molehill, but of a mountain, and in that degree of estimation the work of the Red Cross societies can only be regarded as magnificent from whatever standpoint it may be viewed. End of section 20. End of With the Royal Army Medical Corps in Egypt by Sergeant Major R.A.M.C, a pseudonym of the writer and author Tickner Edwardes.